I still remember the exact moment my heart shattered into a million pieces. It was Christmas Eve. Snow was falling softly outside my parents' window. The fire was crackling. Everything looked like a perfect holiday card. My 6-year-old daughter Lily had spent 3 weeks making a handmade ornament for her grandmother. She had painted it herself, added glitter with her tiny fingers, and wrapped it in tissue paper she decorated with crayon hearts. She walked up to my mother with the biggest smile I had ever seen on her face. "Grandma, I made this for you," she said, holding out her precious gift like it was made of gold. My mother didn't even look at it. Instead, she looked directly at my daughter and said words that I will never forget as long as I live. "Children born to a poor mother shouldn't call me grandma, and I don't want cheap crafts cluttering my tree." The room went silent. My daughter's smile crumbled. Tears streamed down her innocent face. I was frozen. 42 years of being treated like garbage by this woman, and now she was doing it to my child. But then something happened that changed everything. My 15-year-old son Noah slowly stood up from his chair. His eyes were blazing with a fury I had never seen before. He looked directly at my mother and said 6 words that made her face turn white as snow. What he revealed that night exposed a 40-year lie, exposed a massive fraud, and set me on a path to uncover a truth so shocking that by the end of this story my parents would lose everything they ever had. And I would finally discover who I really was. My name is Karen Mitchell, and I am 42 years old. I work as an administrative assistant at a small insurance company, a job that pays the bills but leaves little room for extras. I have raised my 2 children alone for the past 8 years, ever since my husband walked out on us for a younger woman, and never looked back. My son Noah is 15, wise beyond his years and fiercely protective of his little sister. My daughter Lily just turned 6, and she still believes in the magic of Christmas, the goodness of people, and the unconditional love of grandparents. That last belief was about to be destroyed forever. I had driven nearly 2 hours through light snow to reach my parents' house that Christmas Eve, my old sedan making concerning noises the entire way. The heater barely worked, so Noah and Lily huddled under blankets in the back seat, their breath visible in little white puffs. But despite the cold, despite the long drive, despite everything that past experience should have taught me, I felt something dangerously close to hope stirring in my chest. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe the holiday spirit would soften my mother's perpetually critical heart. Maybe my father would actually speak to me like I was his daughter, rather than a stranger who happened to share his last name. I should have known better. 42 years of evidence should have taught me that hoping for love from my parents was like hoping for snow in July. When we arrived, the house was glowing with warmth and light. Through the frosted windows, I could see the enormous Christmas tree my parents always insisted on, decorated with expensive ornaments that had been in the family for generations. I could see my sister Jessica already inside, laughing at something her husband and 2 perfectly dressed children arranged around her like a magazine advertisement for the ideal American family. My mother was hugging Jessica's daughter, her face lit up with the kind of genuine joy I could not remember ever seeing directed at me. I took a deep breath, plastered on my best smile, and led my children to the front door. The contrast between the greeting Jessica received and the one waiting for us could not have been more stark. My mother opened the door and looked at us as though we were charity cases who had wandered in from the cold, which I suppose in her mind we were. She did not hug me. She did not hug Noah or Lily. She simply stepped aside and said in a tone that suggested she was doing us an enormous favor, "Well, you made it. Try not to track snow on the carpet." "Merry Christmas to you too, Mother," I said quietly, but she had already turned away to resume her conversation with Jessica. My father was sitting in his leather armchair by the fireplace, nursing a glass of whiskey. He glanced up when we entered, nodded once in vague acknowledgement, and returned his attention to the flames. No hello. No, good to see you. No questions about the long drive or whether the children were hungry or tired. Just a nod as if we were distant acquaintances he could not quite place. I told myself this was fine. I told myself I was being oversensitive, just as my mother had always accused me of being whenever I tried to address how differently she treated me compared to Jessica. I told myself that the familiar knot of rejection tightening in my stomach was my own problem, my own inability to let go of childhood hurts. I told myself all the lies I had been telling myself for 4 decades. Dinner was an elaborate affair, as it always was at the Douglas household. My mother prided herself on her hosting skills, and the table was laden with a feast that must have cost more than my grocery budget for an entire month. Jessica and her family sat on one side of the table, receiving my mother's constant attention and praise. Noah, Lily, and I sat on the other side, largely ignored, except when my mother wanted to make a pointed comment about how Noah needed a haircut, or how Lily's dress was interesting. Lily, bless her innocent heart, did not notice the undercurrents of hostility. She was too excited about the gift she had brought for her grandmother. For 3 weeks before Christmas, she had worked on a handmade ornament, painting it with careful concentration, adding glitter that got everywhere, wrapping it in tissue paper. She had decorated herself with crayon hearts. Every night she had asked me if I thought Grandma would like it, and every night I had assured her that Grandma would love it, even though a cold part of my heart suspected otherwise. After dinner, Lily could not wait any longer. She retrieved the small wrapped package from her coat pocket and approached my mother with the kind of pure, hopeful excitement that only a 6-year-old can muster. Her eyes were shining. Her smile was so wide it seemed to take up her whole face. "Grandma, I made this for you," she said, holding out the gift like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because to her, it was. My mother looked at the clumsily wrapped package in Lily's outstretched hands. She did not take it. She did not smile. Instead, she glanced at it with visible disgust, the way someone might look at something unpleasant they had stepped in. And then she spoke the words that would change everything. "Children born to a poor mother shouldn't call me Grandma," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. "And I certainly don't want cheap crafts cluttering my tree." Time stopped. The room fell into absolute silence. I saw my sister freeze with her wine glass halfway to her lips. I saw my father's hand tighten around his whiskey glass. I saw my brother-in-law suddenly become fascinated with his napkin. Everyone heard, everyone saw, and no one said a single word in defense of my daughter. Lily's beautiful smile crumbled like a sandcastle hit by a wave. Her lower lip trembled. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks in silent streams. She looked at the gift in her hands, then at her grandmother, then at me, and I could see the exact moment when something broke inside her. The moment when she learned that the world contained cruelty she had never imagined. I moved to my daughter on instinct, kneeling down to wrap my arms around her shaking body. I wanted to scream at my mother. I wanted to overturn the table and tell this horrible woman exactly what I thought of her. But I was frozen, trapped by 42 years of conditioning that told me to be quiet, to not make a scene, to accept the unacceptable, because that was simply how things were in this family. And then I heard a chair scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. I looked up to see Noah standing his 15-year-old frame, suddenly seeming much larger and more imposing than I had ever noticed before. His jaw was clenched, his hands were balled into fists at his sides, and his eyes, my sweet son's gentle brown eyes, were blazing with a fury I had never seen in him before. He stared directly at my mother, and I watched the color drain from her face. Something in his expression made her shift uncomfortably in her seat, made her break eye contact for the first time in my memory. She looked almost afraid, though I could not understand why. The silence stretched unbearably. Then Noah spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade through silk. "Grandma," he said, and the word dripped with contempt. "Tell her the truth. Or I will." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap that refused to fade. Every person in that dining room seemed frozen in place, caught mid-breath, mid-movement, as if time itself had stopped to witness whatever was about to unfold. I remained kneeling on the floor with Lily in my arms, looking up at my son with a mixture of confusion and something that felt dangerously close to hope. What truth? What could Noah possibly know that would make him challenge my mother so boldly? I turned to look at my mother, expecting to see her usual expression of cold dismissal, the same look she had given me countless times throughout my life whenever I dared to question her authority. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. Margaret Douglas was afraid. I had never seen fear on my mother's face before. Not once in 42 years. She was a woman who prided herself on control, on always having the upper hand, on never being caught off guard by anything or anyone. But in that moment, watching her face cycle through confusion, then anger, then something that looked remarkably like terror, I realized that my teenage son had struck a nerve that ran deeper than I could have imagined. "What are you talking about?" my mother finally managed to say, but her voice came out higher than usual, almost shrill. Her eyes darted to my father, then back to Noah, then to my father again. The movement was quick, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. She was looking to Richard for something. Reassurance. A signal I could not tell, but the silent communication between them spoke volumes. My father set down his whiskey glass with a thud that seemed too loud in the silent room. "Noah, sit down," he said, attempting to sound authoritative. "Stop being dramatic. This is Christmas dinner, not a theater production." But his voice lacked conviction. I noticed that his hands were trembling slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair, and he would not meet Noah's eyes. My father, who had spent my entire childhood being distant and dismissive, who rarely showed any emotion at all, was visibly shaken by whatever my son was implying. Noah did not sit down. He stood his ground with a determination that made me realize my little boy had grown into something more, someone more, when I was not looking. "I'm not being dramatic, Grandpa," he said, his voice steady and clear. "This family has been lying for over 15 years, probably longer, and I'm tired of watching everyone pretend everything is fine while my mother gets treated like garbage." "Noah," I said softly, still clutching Lily, who had stopped crying and was now watching her brother with wide, confused eyes. "What are you talking about? What lies?" Before Noah could answer, my mother laughed. The sound was brittle and forced, nothing like her usual confident chuckle of superiority. She waved her hand dismissively, the gesture exaggerated and theatrical. "Oh, for heaven's sake, everyone calm down. He's a teenager. Teenagers are dramatic by nature. He probably read some nonsense on the internet and decided to create a scene." She looked around the table, seeking allies. "He doesn't know anything. He's just trying to cause trouble." But even as she spoke, I noticed things I had never noticed before. Her knuckles were white from gripping her cloth napkin so tightly I thought it might tear. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared on her forehead despite the cool temperature in the dining room. Her eyes kept darting between my father and Noah, tracking the threat, calculating her next move. My mother, the woman who had controlled every aspect of my life with an iron fist wrapped in silk, was scrambling. And in that moment of watching her scramble, I understood something with crystal clarity. There was a truth, something real, something significant enough to make my unshakable mother shake. "What don't you want him to say, Mother?" I heard myself ask, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Stronger, more demanding than I had ever dared to be with her. Margaret's eyes snapped to me, and for just a second, I saw pure hatred there. Not disappointment, not condescension. Hatred. The intensity of it made me flinch, but I did not look away. Whatever she was hiding, it was something she was willing to fight to protect. "Karen, control your son," she said through gritted teeth, abandoning any pretense of holiday pleasantries. "Take your children and leave if you cannot teach them basic manners." "I think that's exactly what I'll do," I said, rising to my feet with Lily still clinging to my neck. My legs felt unsteady, but I forced them to carry me toward the door. "Noah, get your coat. We're leaving." For a moment, I thought my mother might try to stop us, might say something to smooth things over and restore her carefully crafted image of the perfect family Christmas. But she remained silent, watching us go with an expression that was equal parts relief and calculation. Whatever Noah knew she was betting, he would not actually tell me. She was betting on my obedience, my trained compliance, my lifetime of accepting whatever scraps of affection she chose to throw my way. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. The drive home was silent for the first 20 minutes. Lily had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted from crying, her tear-stained face pressed against the cold window of the back seat. I kept my eyes on the snowy road, my mind racing with questions I did not know how to ask. Beside me, Noah stared straight ahead, his jaw still clenched, his young face looking older than 15 in the glow of the dashboard lights. Finally, I could not take the silence any longer. "Noah," I said quietly, not wanting to wake Lily. "I need you to tell me what that was about. What do you know? What have they been lying about?" He did not answer immediately. I glanced over and saw him struggling with something, wrestling with a decision that seemed to weigh heavily on his young shoulders. His hands twisted together in his lap, and I noticed they were shaking slightly, though from cold or emotion I could not tell. "I didn't want to tell you like this," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've known for months, Mom. I found something when we visited for Thanksgiving, and I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, or if I should tell you at all. I thought maybe it was better if you didn't know. I thought I was protecting you." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Protecting me from what, Noah? What could possibly be so bad that you felt you had to keep it from me?" He turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw a maturity that broke my heart. My boy had been carrying a burden alone, trying to shield me from something he thought would hurt me, just like I had always tried to shield him and Lily from my parents' cruelty. "After what Grandma did to Lily tonight," he said slowly, "I realized I was wrong. Protecting you from the truth isn't protecting you at all. It's just helping them keep hurting you." He paused, taking a deep breath that seemed to fill the entire car. "Mom, I know something about them. Something big. And I think you deserve to finally know too." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white against the worn leather. The snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes dancing in my headlights like tiny ghosts, but I barely noticed. My mind had begun its own journey, traveling backward, through years of memories I had spent decades trying to bury. Noah's words had unlocked something inside me, and now the floodgates were opening whether I wanted them to or not. I remembered being 7 years old, watching Jessica unwrap a beautiful pink dress on Christmas morning, while I opened a package containing Jessica's old clothes from the previous year, re-wrapped in fresh paper, as though that somehow made them new. I remembered my mother's explanation that money was tight that year, even though Jessica's dress still had the price tag attached. I remembered telling myself it was fine that hand-me-downs were practical, that I should be grateful for anything at all. I remembered being 8 years old, struggling with a math assignment at the kitchen table while my mother prepared dinner. I had asked for help, and she had sighed so heavily it seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Without even looking at me, she had muttered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear, "Sometimes I feel like you're nothing but dead weight around here." I had pretended not to hear. I had finished my homework through blurred vision, tears dropping silently onto my paper. I remembered birthday parties where Jessica received elaborate gifts, carefully chosen items that showed thought and love and consideration. My birthdays were different. My gifts came in hastily wrapped packages, often things bought at the last minute from the clearance section, practical items like socks or school supplies rather than toys or games. One year when I turned 10, my mother forgot my birthday entirely until Jessica mentioned it at dinner. There was no cake that year, no candles, no song, just a mumbled apology and a $20 bill pressed into my hand like payment for an inconvenience. I remembered asking my mother for a hug once. I must have been 11 or 12, old enough to understand that other children received affection from their parents, but still young enough to hope I might somehow earn it too. I had approached her in the kitchen, arms slightly open, heart pounding with vulnerability. She had stepped back as though I carried a contagious disease. "Don't be so needy," she had said, her voice dripping with disgust. "No one likes a clingy child." I never asked again. The memories kept coming relentless now, each one more painful than the last. I thought about how my mother never looked me in the eye during conversations, how her gaze always seemed to slide past me as though I were a piece of furniture she was trying to ignore. I thought about my father, how he would physically leave any room I entered, how he would suddenly remember urgent tasks whenever I tried to engage him in even the most basic conversation. For decades, I had convinced myself this was normal, that some parents were simply less affectionate than others, that I must somehow deserve this treatment, even if I could not understand why. I remembered the family vacations. Every summer, my parents would announce a trip to some exciting destination, the beach or the mountains, or an amusement park hours away. Jessica always went. I never did. The excuses varied each year, but they all amounted to the same thing. There was not enough room in the car. Someone needed to stay home to watch the house. I would not enjoy it anyway. I spent those summers alone with my grandmother Eleanor, who was the only person in the family who seemed genuinely happy to spend time with me. At the time, I thought I was being punished for something. Now I wondered if I was simply being excluded from a family that never considered me a member at all. And then there was the argument. I was 12 years old, lying in my bed late at night when I heard my parents' voices rising from their bedroom down the hall. They were fighting about something, their words muffled but their tone unmistakable. I had crept to my door and pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear. Most of what they said was unintelligible, but one sentence cut through clearly, my mother's voice, sharp and venomous. "Karen was never supposed to be part of this family," she had screamed at my father. "Never." I had told myself I misheard. For 30 years I had convinced myself that she must have said something else, that my sleepy 12-year-old brain had twisted the words into something more hurtful than intended. But sitting in my freezing car on Christmas Eve, watching snow accumulate on my windshield, I finally allowed myself to consider that I had heard exactly what she said. Karen was never supposed to be part of this family. Another thought struck me with sudden force. I looked nothing like anyone in my family. My mother, father, and Jessica all shared the same dark brown eyes and olive complexion, the same slight build and delicate features. I had light hazel eyes and fair skin that burned easily in the summer. I was taller than both my parents, broader in the shoulders, built differently in every way. I had noticed these differences my entire life, but had always dismissed them as genetic quirks, random variations in the family gene pool. Now those differences seemed to pulse with new significance. "Mom," Noah said softly, pulling me back to the present. "Are you okay to hear this?" I realized I had been silent for several minutes, lost in the labyrinth of my own memories. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and focused on the road ahead while preparing myself for whatever came next. Noah began explaining slowly, choosing his words with care. Several months ago at Thanksgiving, he had been at my parents' house looking for the Wi-Fi password. My father kept the password written on a notepad in his office, and Noah had gone searching for it while the adults were occupied with dinner preparations. While rummaging through the desk drawers, he had found something unexpected: a legal document with an official-looking header that read, "Douglas Family Trust Revised Beneficiary List." Noah had been curious, so he read it. The document listed beneficiaries of some kind of family trust, people who would inherit money or property upon certain conditions. Jessica's name was there, but so was mine, or rather my name had been there. Someone had crossed it out with red ink, a thick, angry line that obliterated the letters. Next to the crossed-out name, squeezed into the margin in my mother's handwriting, was Jessica's name as a replacement. Noah admitted he had not understood fully what he was looking at, but the sight of his mother's name violently crossed out had disturbed him enough to take a photo with his phone. Later at home, he had researched family trusts and inheritance law, trying to make sense of what he had seen. What he learned shocked him. Someone had deliberately removed me from my inheritance. Someone had decided I would receive nothing while Jessica received everything. But that was not the worst part. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, "your name wasn't just crossed out. It was like someone wanted to erase you completely. There were marks all over the document, like someone had tried to change things to rewrite parts of it." He paused, and I could feel him looking at me, gauging my reaction. And there was a note in the margin right next to where your name used to be. It said, K never to know. K never to know. Those 3 words echoed in my mind for days after Christmas, bouncing off the walls of my skull like a cruel refrain that refused to fade. I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling of my small bedroom, watching shadows shift in the darkness, replaying every moment of that horrible dinner and every word Noah had spoken in the car afterward. Sleep came in fragments, brief periods of exhausted unconsciousness, interrupted by dreams that woke me, gasping dreams, where I was a child again, standing outside my family's house, with my face pressed against the glass, watching them celebrate without me. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a fog. I went through the motions of daily life because my children needed me to function. I made breakfast each morning, scrambled eggs and toast that I barely touched, while Noah and Lily ate in sleepy silence. I drove to work at the insurance office, sat at my desk, answered phones and filed paperwork with mechanical precision while my thoughts churned endlessly beneath the surface. I came home, helped Lily with her drawings, praised her artwork with words that felt hollow in my mouth, tucked her into bed with stories and kisses that she deserved from a mother who was fully present rather than one whose mind was trapped in the past. Noah watched me with worried eyes, but did not press. He understood perhaps better than any 15-year-old should that I needed time to process what he had revealed. He took on extra responsibilities without being asked, washing dishes, entertaining Lily, giving me space to wrestle with demons he had unknowingly unleashed. I loved him fiercely for that silent support, even as I hated that my son had been forced to grow up faster than childhood should allow. The question that haunted me most was deceptively simple. Did I really want to know the truth? Part of me, the part that had spent 42 years learning to accept rejection and minimize my own pain, wanted desperately to let this go. What good would digging up secrets do? My parents did not love me. They had never loved me. Perhaps knowing why would not change anything. Perhaps it would only add new wounds to a heart already covered in scars. I could continue living my quiet life, raising my children, working my modest job, and pretend that Christmas Eve had never happened. I could choose peace over truth. But another part of me, a part that had been silent and suppressed for my entire life, refused to stay quiet any longer. That part remembered Lily's face crumbling at my mother's cruel words. That part remembered Noah standing up to defend me when no one else in the family ever had. That part whispered that my children were watching, learning from my example, and if I accepted this treatment without question, I would be teaching them that being treated like garbage was acceptable as long as it came from family. I could not let that lesson stand. On the 4th day after Christmas, I began to research. I waited until Noah had taken Lily to the park, then sat down at my ancient laptop and typed words into the search engine that I never imagined I would need. Family trusts, inheritance law, document fraud, beneficiary rights. Each search led to more searches, more articles, more legal terminology that I struggled to understand but forced myself to learn. What I discovered made my blood run cold. I learned that there were 2 main types of trusts. Revocable trusts could be changed at any time by the person who created them. But irrevocable trusts were different. Once the creator died, an irrevocable trust became essentially locked. Its terms could not be altered. Its beneficiaries could not be changed without very specific legal procedures that left clear paper trails. If someone modified an irrevocable trust after the creator's death without following proper legal channels, that modification was not just invalid. It was potentially criminal fraud. My grandmother Eleanor had died when I was 25 years old. I remembered that time vividly because her death had devastated me in ways I could not fully express. She was the only person in my family who had ever made me feel loved, the only one who looked at me with warmth rather than cold indifference. She used to hold my hand and tell me I was special, that I had a strength inside me that would carry me through whatever life threw my way. When she died, I felt like I had lost my only ally in a hostile world. Now I wondered if Grandma Eleanor had tried to protect me even after death. What if she had created a trust, an irrevocable trust, that included me as a beneficiary. What if my parents had found a way to circumvent her wishes to steal what she had intended for me? The thought made me physically ill, not because of the money, but because it meant my grandmother's final act of love had been violated by the very people who should have honored her memory. The more I researched, the more I realized this was not simply family dysfunction or favoritism taken to extremes. If Noah's description of that document was accurate, if my name had been crossed out and replaced with Jessica's on an official trust document, then my parents might have committed actual crimes. Fraud, forgery, theft. The words felt strange and heavy, too serious for the mundane reality of my life, but they also felt terrifyingly possible. I made my decision on New Year's Eve sitting alone in my kitchen while the neighbors' fireworks exploded in the distance. I would go back to my parents' house. I would find that document Noah had described. I would learn the truth, whatever it was, whatever it cost me. The next morning, I called Noah into the kitchen and told him my plan. I would visit my parents' house under the pretense of retrieving a stuffed animal that Lily had supposedly left behind. I knew the risk. If my mother caught me searching through my father's office, she would accuse me of snooping, of paranoia, of trying to destroy the family with baseless accusations. But I had spent my entire life being the good daughter, the quiet one, the child who never made waves or demanded explanations. And where had that compliance gotten me? Excluded. Dismissed. Erased. Noah immediately offered to come with me, his young face set with determination. I refused gently but firmly. I needed him to stay home with Lily. If something went wrong, if my parents reacted badly, I needed to know my children were safe and far away from the confrontation. He started to argue, but something in my expression stopped him. He nodded slowly, accepting my decision, even though I could see it pained him to let me face this alone. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped them twice. But beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty, I felt something else stirring in my chest. Resolve. Determination. A fierce, burning need to finally understand why I had been treated as less than nothing by the people who were supposed to love me most. I took a deep breath and opened the front door. It's time to find out what they've been hiding from me my entire life. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual, each mile stretching into eternity as my resolve battled with my fear. I had timed my visit carefully, choosing Wednesday afternoon because my parents had maintained their weekly bridge club routine for as long as I could remember. Every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, they drove to the country club and did not return until well after 7. That gave me a window of several hours to search the house without interruption, assuming nothing had changed in the months since I had last been forced to endure one of their obligatory family gatherings. I parked my car 2 blocks away, a precaution that felt paranoid even as I took it. The neighborhood was quiet in the gray January afternoon, most residents tucked inside their warm homes, oblivious to the woman walking briskly down the sidewalk with her heart hammering against her ribs. When I reached my parents' house, I paused at the end of the driveway, suddenly paralyzed by the magnitude of what I was about to do. This was breaking and entering. This was snooping through private documents. This was everything my mother had ever accused me of, being paranoid and dramatic, and incapable of leaving well enough alone. But then I thought of Noah's face when he told me about the document. I thought of my name crossed out in angry red ink. I thought of 3 words scrawled in a margin. K. Never to know. I walked up the driveway and climbed the front porch steps. My old house key was still on my keyring, a tarnished brass relic from a time when I foolishly believed I might someday be welcome here. I had kept it for years without knowing why, perhaps out of sentiment, perhaps out of some desperate hope that things might change. I slid it into the lock and turned, half expecting it to stick, half expecting the locks to have been changed specifically to keep me out. But the mechanism clicked smoothly, and the door swung open onto the familiar foyer. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, my senses suddenly heightened to an almost painful degree. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sounded like a thunderclap. Every distant car passing on the street made me flinch. The house that had been my childhood prison now felt like something else entirely. A crime scene waiting to be discovered. A museum of secrets I had never been allowed to see. I moved quickly through the hallway toward my father's office at the back of the house. The door was closed, and when I tried the handle, it refused to turn. Locked. Of course it was locked. My father had always been protective of his private space, the one room in the house where even my mother rarely ventured. For a moment I felt despair wash over me, my mission thwarted before it had truly begun. Then I remembered something from my childhood, a detail so small I was amazed it surfaced through the fog of decades. My father kept a spare key to his office taped under a decorative plate on the hallway table, a blue and white porcelain dish that had belonged to his mother. He thought no one knew about it, but I had discovered his hiding spot by accident when I was 10 years old, searching for a pen to complete my homework. I had never used the key, never dared to violate his sacred space. Until now. I lifted the plate with trembling fingers. The key was still there, yellowed tape holding it in place, as though time had frozen this one small corner of the world. Some things never change. The office door opened with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the silent house. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, then stood for a moment letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains. The room smelled of old paper and my father's cologne scents that transported me instantly back to childhood, to the rare occasions when I had been permitted to enter this forbidden space. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes I doubted anyone had ever read completed the picture of masculine authority my father had always tried to project. I began searching systematically, starting with the filing cabinets. I found financial documents stretching back decades-old tax returns organized by year property deeds, insurance policies, investment statements. I found records of my parents' cars, their country club membership, their various subscriptions and charitable donations. But I did not find what Noah had described. No trust document, no beneficiary list, no evidence of the fraud I had come to uncover. Frustration began to build in my chest as I moved to the desk. The drawers yielded more of the same mundane paperwork that told me nothing I did not already know. I was about to give up to accept that my father must have moved or destroyed the incriminating document when I noticed something odd about the desk itself. One section of the wooden panel on the front of the desk looked slightly different from the rest, the stain a shade lighter as though the wood had been replaced or repaired at some point. I ran my fingers along the surface and felt a subtle ridge where the original panel met the newer one. Acting on instinct, I pressed firmly on the lighter section of wood. Something clicked, and a small compartment swung open, revealing a hidden space I would never have found if I had not been looking for anomalies. Inside the compartment, I found a worn leather journal and several yellowed envelopes tied together with faded ribbon. My hands began to tremble as I pulled these items from their hiding place because I recognized the journal immediately. The leather was cracked with age, but the initials embossed on the cover were unmistakable. E.D. Eleanor Douglas, my grandmother. I opened the journal with shaking fingers, and the first thing I saw was my grandmother's familiar handwriting, the elegant cursive she had used to write me birthday cards that were always more thoughtful than any gift my parents gave. But these were not birthday wishes. The first page contained only a single sentence that made my breath catch in my throat. For Karen, when she's ready to know the truth. I began scanning the pages as quickly as I could, my heart pounding with each new revelation. My grandmother had known. She had known something was terribly wrong with how my parents treated me, and she had documented her suspicions in meticulous detail. She wrote about watching Margaret interact with me versus Jessica, about the coldness she observed, about her growing conviction that Margaret was hiding something significant about my birth. She wrote about money she had secretly set aside for me, funds she had hidden in ways my parents could not access or discover. She wrote about her fears for my future, her desperate hope that I would someday find this journal and understand that I had been loved, that I had always been loved, even when everyone around me seemed determined to make me feel worthless. The yellowed letters were addressed to me in my grandmother's hand, letters that had never been sent, letters filled with explanations she had been too afraid to share while alive. I was so absorbed in reading, so lost in my grandmother's words reaching across the years to embrace me, that I did not hear the front door open. I did not hear the footsteps coming down the hallway. I did not hear anything at all until the office door swung open, and I looked up to find my father standing frozen in the doorway, his face pale as a ghost. "Karen," he said, his voice cracking on my name. "Why are you in my office? And where did you find that journal?" Write this section in first-person perspective with the following requirements. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My father stood frozen in the doorway, his keys still dangling from one hand, his face drained of all color. I remained behind his desk, my grandmother's journal clutched against my chest like a shield, my heart pounding so violently I was certain he could hear it from across the room. The silence between us was thick enough to choke on, filled with decades of unspoken words and carefully guarded secrets that were now threatening to spill into the open. I found my voice first. "I know about the trust document," I said, surprising myself with how steady my words came out despite the terror coursing through my veins. "I know my name was crossed out. I know someone replaced me with Jessica, and I know there's a note that says I was never supposed to find out." I held up the journal, watching his eyes track to it with an expression of pure dread. "Grandma Eleanor knew too. She wrote about it. She wrote about all of it." Richard's face cycled through a rapid succession of emotions that I struggled to catalog. Shock came first, his eyes widening as the implications of my discovery sank in. Then came anger, a flash of the cold disapproval I had seen directed at me countless times throughout my childhood. But what followed surprised me more than anything else could have. The anger drained away, replaced by something I had never seen on my father's face before. Profound, bone-deep sadness. A weariness so complete it seemed to age him 10 years in a matter of seconds. He did not yell at me to leave. He did not threaten to call the police for trespassing. Instead, he walked slowly to his office chair and sank into it like a man whose strings had been cut. He seemed to deflate before my eyes, shrinking into himself, becoming smaller and older and infinitely more human than the distant, disapproving figure I had known all my life. "You were never supposed to find any of this," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother made sure of that. She made sure of everything." His tone held no threat, no warning, just exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had been carrying an impossible weight for longer than he could bear. I realized in that moment that I was not looking at my enemy. I was looking at a prisoner, someone who had been trapped in my mother's web, just as surely as I had been, even if his cage was made of complicity rather than cruelty. "Why?" I demanded, my voice cracking on the single syllable. "Why was I treated differently my whole life? Why did she hate me so much? Why was I cut out of everything?" The questions tumbled out of me in a rush, 42 years of confusion and pain, compressing into a few desperate sentences. What did I ever do to deserve any of this? Richard was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his words stopped my heart mid-beat. "You were never meant to inherit anything, Karen." He paused, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were filled with something that looked horrifyingly like pity. "Because you were never meant to be part of this family." The words hung between us, each one a hammer blow to everything I thought I knew about my own life. I opened my mouth to respond, to demand clarification, to scream or cry, or do something other than stand there in stunned silence. But nothing came out. I could only stare at this man, this stranger who had raised me without ever truly being my father, and try to make sense of words that made no sense at all. "What does that mean?" I finally managed to whisper. "Never meant to be part of this family. I was born into this family. I grew up in this house. How can you say I was never meant to be here?" Richard's hands were shaking now, trembling visibly as he gripped the arms of his chair. I noticed moisture gathering in his eyes. tears that he seemed to be fighting desperately to hold back. This was not the cold, distant man who had ignored me for 4 decades. This was someone broken, someone haunted by secrets that had eaten away at him from the inside. "Ask your mother," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was always her secret to keep. I wanted to tell you, Karen. So many times over the years I wanted to explain, but she wouldn't allow it. She said it would destroy everything she had built. She said you would be better off not knowing." He laughed bitterly. "Better off, as if the not knowing hadn't already destroyed you in 100 smaller ways." I pressed him for more, begging him to explain what he meant to tell me the truth my mother had kept hidden for so long. But he shook his head, his jaw set with a stubbornness I recognized from years of trying to break through his emotional walls. Whatever secret he was guarding, he was not ready to speak it aloud. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps the words had been locked inside him for so long that he had lost the key. In his agitation, Richard stood abruptly from his chair, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His elbow caught a stack of files perched on the edge of his desk, sending them cascading to the floor in a waterfall of paper. Documents scattered across the carpet, spreading in every direction, like secrets escaping from their prison. Instinctively, I bent to help gather them. Years of training, of trying to be helpful, of attempting to earn approval that never came, kicked in before I could stop myself. I was reaching for a handful of papers when one document caught my eye and froze my hand in mid-air. It was an old medical form, the paper yellowed with age, the print slightly faded but still perfectly legible. The header read, "Paternity Test, Confidential," in bold capital letters. Below that was a date from 42 years ago, the year I was born. My hands moved of their own accord, picking up the document, bringing it closer to my face. I scanned the contents with eyes that refused to believe what they were seeing. Subject's name, mother's name, alleged father's name, and then, at the bottom, the results that changed everything. I read the words aloud, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. Father Richard Douglas. Result excluded. 0% probability of paternity. The document trembled in my grip as the meaning of those clinical scientific words sank into my brain. I looked up slowly, meeting the eyes of the man I had called Dad for 42 years, the man who had ignored me and dismissed me and made me feel worthless for as long as I could remember. "You're not my father." The question came out broken, shattered into pieces, just like everything I thought I knew about myself. "If you're not my father, then who is?" The room began to spin around me, the walls of my father's office tilting at impossible angles as the full weight of what I had just learned crashed down upon my shoulders. Richard Douglas was not my biological father. The man who had raised me, who had ignored me, who had made me feel like an unwanted guest in my own home for 42 years, shared no blood with me at all. I reached for the edge of the desk to steady myself, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me, my mind struggling to process a truth that rewrote everything I thought I knew about my own existence. And yet, even as the shock threatened to overwhelm me, a strange clarity began to emerge from the chaos. This single fact explained everything. The coldness, the favoritism toward Jessica, the constant feeling of being an outsider in my own family, of being somehow different from everyone around me, of belonging nowhere and to no one. I had spent my entire life believing there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some flaw in my character or personality that made me unworthy of love. Now I understood that the flaw had never been mine at all. I was simply the living evidence of a betrayal that Richard could never forgive. Richard sat motionless in his chair, watching me with eyes that held neither anger nor accusation, only a deep, abiding weariness that seemed to seep from every pore. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and measured, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this confession in his mind for decades, without ever expecting to deliver it. "I found out when you were 2 years old," he said. "Your mother got sick, some kind of infection, and she needed a blood transfusion. The doctors ran tests and something didn't match. I demanded answers." He paused, his hands clenching in his lap. "Margaret confessed everything. She had an affair, She got pregnant. She convinced me the baby was mine because she knew I would never stay with her otherwise. For 2 years I believed you were my daughter. I loved you like my own." His voice cracked on the last words, and I saw genuine pain flash across his face before he composed himself. "What changed?" I asked, my voice barely recognizable to my own ears. "I changed," Richard admitted. "The moment I learned the truth, something inside me broke." Margaret begged me not to leave. She swore it was a one-time mistake, that it would never happen again, that she loved me and needed me and couldn't survive without me. I was weak. I was afraid of scandal, of divorce, of what people would say. So I agreed to stay. I agreed to raise you as my own. He looked at me then, and his eyes were swimming with tears he refused to let fall. "But I could never fully accept you, Karen. Every time I looked at you, I saw her betrayal. I saw the lies she had told me. I saw the family I thought I had crumbling to dust. It wasn't fair to you. I know that. You were an innocent child who had done nothing wrong. But I couldn't separate the sin from the sinner, and you paid the price for my weakness." I stood in silence, letting his words wash over me, feeling 42 years of confusion finally begin to make a terrible kind of sense. I had not imagined the distance between us. I had not invented the coldness, the averted gazes, the way he seemed to physically recoil whenever I came too close. He had been punishing me my entire life for a crime I did not commit, making me pay for my mother's choices, simply because I had the misfortune of being born from them. "Who is he?" I heard myself ask. "My biological father. Who is he?" Richard's jaw tightened at the question, his teeth clenching behind pressed lips. For a moment I thought he would refuse to answer, would retreat back into the wall of silence he had hidden behind for so long. But something had shifted between us in this room full of secrets, and perhaps he was tired of carrying burdens that were never his to bear. "His name was Harold Mitchell," Richard said finally. "He wanted to be part of your life, actually. Came to the house several times when you were little, demanding to see you, insisting on his rights as your father." He shook his head slowly. "Your mother wouldn't allow it. She said he would ruin everything she had built, expose her lies, destroy our family. She drove him away every time." A memory surfaced from the depths of my mind, rising up through layers of time like a bubble ascending through dark water. I was 4 years old, maybe 5, standing at my bedroom window on a summer evening. There was a man at the end of our driveway, a stranger I had never seen before. He was looking at the house with an expression of such profound grief that even my young mind recognized it as heartbreak. Tears were streaming down his face. My mother's voice shattered the silence, screaming at him to leave, to never come back, to stay away from her family, or she would call the police. The man had stood there for a long moment, his eyes scanning the windows as if searching for something precious he had lost. Then he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I had always thought it was a nightmare, a bad dream that felt too real. Now I understood it was a memory of my real father being driven away from me while I watched helplessly from above. "There's more," Richard said, pulling me back to the present. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew another document, this one crisp and formal despite its age. "I found this years ago. Your mother doesn't know I have it." I took the paper from his outstretched hand and read the header. Paternity Settlement Agreement. Below it were 3 signatures: Harold Mitchell, Margaret Douglas, and a witness, some lawyer whose name meant nothing to me. My eyes scanned the contents, each clause more devastating than the last. According to this document, Harold Mitchell had paid my mother $50,000. In exchange, Margaret agreed to never reveal Harold's identity to me, to never seek additional child support, and to ensure that Harold would have no contact with me whatsoever. She had sold my right to know my own father. She had sold my entire identity for $50,000. I stared at the paper in disbelief, my hands trembling so violently that the words blurred before my eyes. All those years of wondering why my mother hated me, why she treated me as less than human, why she seemed to view me with contempt rather than love. Now I understood. I was not her daughter in her eyes. I was a transaction, a commodity, a mistake that she had managed to monetize before discarding entirely. Something fundamental shifted inside me at that moment. The last thread of hope I had been unconsciously clinging to, the desperate wish that there might be some explanation that would make everything okay, snapped completely. My mother had not simply failed to love me. She had actively profited from my existence while working to erase me from the family she cared about. There would be no reconciliation. There would be no understanding. There would only be truth and justice, and perhaps finally revenge. I folded both documents carefully, the paternity test and the settlement agreement, and placed them in my purse. When I looked up at Richard, my eyes were dry and my voice was steady with a cold determination I had never felt before. "I'm going to find Harold Mitchell," I said, "and then I'm going to make sure my mother pays for every single lie." I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel on autopilot while my mind struggled to process the earthquake that had just shattered the foundations of my entire existence. The documents in my purse felt impossibly heavy, as though they contained the weight of 42 years of lies and betrayal compressed into a few sheets of aging paper. I barely noticed the roads I traveled, the traffic lights. I stopped at the other cars, moving around me like fish in a stream. I was drowning in revelations, gasping for air in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Noah was waiting for me when I walked through the door, his young face tight with worry. One look at my expression told him everything he needed to know. He guided me to the couch, brought me a glass of water I could not drink, and sat beside me in supportive silence while I struggled to find words for what I had discovered. Lily was already asleep, thankfully spared from witnessing her mother's unraveling. When I finally managed to tell Noah what had happened, his face cycled through the same shock and anger I had experienced in that office. But beneath it all, I saw something else. Validation. His suspicions had been correct. The family that had treated his mother like garbage had been hiding something monstrous all along. After Noah went to bed, I sat alone in the dim light of my living room and began reading my grandmother's journal more carefully than I had been able to in that panic-filled office. Each page revealed new depths to the conspiracy that had shaped my life, new layers of deception that made my stomach churn with a mixture of rage and grief. Eleanor had known everything. She had known about the affair, about my true parentage, about the settlement agreement that traded my identity for cash. She had documented it all in her elegant handwriting, a testament to truths she was forbidden to speak aloud. Eleanor wrote about Harold Mitchell with a warmth that surprised me. She described him as a good man trapped by circumstances beyond his control, someone who had made mistakes but who genuinely loved me and wanted to be part of my life. She wrote about how Margaret had weaponized an innocent child for profit, using me as leverage first to secure money from Harold, then to maintain control over Richard by threatening to reveal his humiliation to their social circle. In my mother's hands, I had never been a daughter. I had been a tool, a bargaining chip, a piece on a chessboard that she moved according to her own selfish strategies. The journal revealed that Harold had not simply disappeared after signing that settlement agreement. He had tried for years to maintain some connection to me, sending money beyond what the agreement required, mailing birthday cards and letters addressed to a daughter he was forbidden to see. But Margaret intercepted everything. Every check was deposited into accounts I never knew existed. Every card was destroyed before it could reach my hands. Every letter was burned, its words of love and longing reduced to ash before I could ever read them. Harold Mitchell had spent years reaching out to me across the void my mother had created and I had never known. I had grown up believing no one wanted me, while somewhere out there a man was writing letters to a daughter who would never receive them. Eleanor discovered the truth eventually. She found one of Harold's letters before Margaret could destroy it, and confronted her daughter-in-law in a conversation she documented in devastating detail. Margaret's response was not remorse or shame, but cold calculation. She threatened to take both children and leave the state if Eleanor said a single word to anyone. She would claim that Eleanor was senile, mentally unstable, making up stories to destroy her son's marriage. Eleanor would never see her grandchildren again. Faced with this ultimatum, my grandmother made a choice that clearly haunted her for the rest of her life. She chose silence to protect her access to Jessica and me, hoping that someday she would find another way to reveal the truth. The journal mentioned that Eleanor met secretly with Harold twice over the years, meetings arranged through careful subterfuge to avoid Margaret's watchful eyes. She promised Harold that she would tell me everything when I was old enough to understand, when I was independent enough that Margaret could not use me as a weapon anymore. But time ran out. Eleanor's health declined faster than anyone expected, and she died before she could fulfill her promise. One of the final entries in the journal broke my heart into pieces I was not sure could ever be reassembled. "I have failed Karen," she had written in a shaking hand that spoke to her declining strength. "I should have been braver. I should have told her everything, consequences be damned. I let fear control me, and now my granddaughter will grow up believing she is unloved, unwanted, a burden to everyone around her. The guilt is unbearable. I can only pray that someday, somehow, the truth finds its way to her. I have prepared what I can hidden where Margaret cannot reach. Perhaps these words will be my redemption, even if they come too late." I closed the journal and wept. I wept for my grandmother, who had loved me in silence. I wept for Harold Mitchell, who had been erased from my life by a woman who saw love as weakness and family as a weapon. I wept for the child I had been, the lonely little girl who had blamed herself for her family's coldness when the truth was far more sinister than she could have imagined. The next morning, Noah found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and documents, dark circles under my eyes from a sleepless night. Without a word, he sat down beside me and opened his laptop. He understood what I needed without being told. We needed to find Harold Mitchell. The name was common, Noah warned me, but he was clever in ways that made me simultaneously proud and slightly worried about his future career options. He cross-referenced the name with the address listed on the settlement agreement, an address that was over 40 years old, but provided a starting point. He searched property records, voter registrations, social media accounts. He narrowed down possibilities and eliminated dead ends with a methodical patience that reminded me how much he had grown in the past year. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of searching, Noah turned his laptop to face me. On the screen was a simple listing. Harold Mitchell, age 68, retired, residing at an address only 2 hours away, the same general region where he had lived when he signed away his rights to me 4 decades ago. He had never moved far, I realized with a pang. He had stayed close, perhaps hoping against hope that someday his daughter would come looking for him. I stared at the address on the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. Somewhere out there 2 hours away was a man who had wondered about me for 40 years. A man who had written letters I never received. A man who had been driven away in tears while I watched from my bedroom window. A man who had actually wanted me. I picked up my phone and stared at it, my finger hovering over the screen. "Do I just show up at his door?" I asked Noah, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do I even say? Hi, I'm the daughter you were forced to abandon 40 years ago." The 2-hour drive to Harold Mitchell's neighborhood felt simultaneously endless and far too short. I needed time to prepare what I would say, to rehearse the words that would introduce me to a father I had never known, but no amount of time could have been enough. How do you condense 42 years of absence into a greeting? How do you explain to a stranger that you are the daughter he was forced to abandon, that you have spent your entire life believing you were unwanted when the truth was so much more complicated and cruel? Noah had offered to come with me, but I needed to do this alone. This moment, whatever it turned out to be, belonged to Harold and me. It was too raw, too personal, too weighted with decades of lost time to share with anyone else. Even my son, who had been instrumental in bringing me to this point. I promised to call him as soon as I could, kissed Lily goodbye without explaining where I was going, and drove into the unknown with my grandmother's journal on the passenger seat beside me, like a talisman. When I finally found the address, I could not bring myself to get out of the car. I parked across the street and sat there, engine off, staring at the house where my biological father lived. It was modest but well-maintained, a single-story home with pale blue siding and white trim that looked recently painted. A vegetable garden occupied one corner of the front yard, winter dormant, but clearly tended with care. A porch swing hung from the covered entrance, swaying slightly in the January breeze. Wind chimes dangled near the door, their soft music carrying across the quiet street to my open window. This was a home built with love. I could see it in every detail, every small touch that spoke of someone who took pride in creating a peaceful sanctuary. It looked nothing like the cold, immaculate showpiece where I had grown up, where every object was chosen for appearance rather than comfort, and where warmth was as absent as genuine affection. Harold Mitchell had built something real here, something I had been denied my entire life. I sat there for 30 minutes, unable to move, unable to decide whether to approach the door or drive away and pretend I had never come. What if he did not want to see me? What if the settlement agreement had been his choice after all? A way to escape responsibility for a child he never truly wanted? What if Eleanor's journal had painted too rosy a picture of a man who had simply paid to make his problem disappear? The questions spiraled through my mind, each one feeding my paralysis, keeping me frozen behind the wheel of my aging sedan while my father's house waited silently across the street. I was about to start my engine and flee when a tap on my window nearly made me scream. An elderly woman stood beside my car, her white hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face creased with the kind of wrinkles that come from a lifetime of smiling. She wore a thick cardigan despite the cold, and carried a small watering can apparently caught mid-task by curiosity about the stranger who had been sitting outside her neighbor's house for half an hour. I rolled down my window, my heart hammering with sudden fear. Had I been too obvious? Would this woman call the police report a suspicious person lurking in the neighborhood? But her expression held only friendly concern. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice carrying the warm drawl of someone who had lived in this region all her life. "I noticed you sitting here and wanted to make sure you weren't lost or having car trouble." I scrambled for an explanation that would not reveal too much. "I'm fine, thank you. I was just looking for someone's house and wanted to make sure I had the right address." The woman glanced toward Harold's home. "That's Harold Mitchell's place," she said. "Are you looking for him?" "I'm Dorothy, his neighbor, for going on 26 years now. If you're a friend of his, I can tell you he's home. Saw him in his garden just this morning." Something in her open, trusting face made me want to confide in her. Instead, I asked carefully, "What kind of person is he, Harold Mitchell, I mean? What's he like?" Dorothy's face softened with genuine affection. "Oh, Harold's one of the good ones. Salt of the earth, that man. Lost his wife Patricia about 5 years back, cancer, terrible thing. They were married for over 30 years, devoted to each other until the end. He's got 2 grown children, Sarah and Michael, who visit him regular as clockwork. Good family man through and through." She paused and something shifted in her expression. A shadow of sadness crossed her weathered features. "But I'll tell you something, dear. That man has carried a sadness his whole life that even Patricia couldn't fully heal. He told me about it once years ago after we'd both had a bit too much wine at a neighborhood barbecue. I held my breath, afraid to speak, afraid to break whatever spell was allowing this stranger to share secrets that felt like they belonged to me. He said he had a daughter he lost," Dorothy continued quietly. "Not to death, mind you, but to circumstances. Said he was never allowed to be her father, that she was taken from him when she was just a baby, and it's been his greatest regret ever since." She shook her head slowly. "That man keeps a photograph in his wallet, been there as long as I've known him. I asked him about it once, and he got this look in his eyes, the saddest thing I ever saw. He said it was his daughter, the one he couldn't save. Said he never stopped loving her, not for one single day." The tears came before I could stop them, streaming down my cheeks in hot rivers that I could not control. For 42 years I had believed I was unwanted, unloved, a mistake that everyone wished had never happened. I had built my entire identity around the assumption that something was fundamentally wrong with me, that I was somehow unworthy of the love other people received so easily. And now this stranger, this kind elderly woman who had simply wanted to check on a suspicious car, was telling me that someone had wanted me all along. Someone had loved me without ever being allowed to show it. Someone had carried my photograph in his wallet for decades, a father mourning a daughter who was still alive. Dorothy noticed my tears, and her eyes widened with concern. "Oh dear, are you all right? Did I say something wrong?" I shook my head, struggling to find my voice through the emotion that threatened to choke me. "No," I managed to whisper. "You said something very right." I took a shuddering breath and looked at her with eyes that must have been red and swollen. "I think I might be that daughter. The one in the photograph." Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. For a long moment she simply stared at me, processing what I had just revealed. Then her eyes filled with tears of their own, and she reached through my open window to grab my hands with surprising strength. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed. "Oh, you precious girl. You need to go to that door right now. That man has waited his entire life for this moment. Don't make him wait another minute." I stepped out of my car on legs that felt like they might collapse beneath me. Dorothy squeezed my arm encouragingly, then stepped back to give me space. The walk across the street and up Harold Mitchell's pathway felt like the longest journey of my life, each step carrying me closer to a truth I had never known I was missing. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorbell, my finger hovering over the button, while my heart threatened to burst from my chest. Before I could press it, the door swung open. An elderly man stood before me, his hair silver with age, his face lined with years of joy and sorrow. But his eyes, those eyes that met mine with sudden shock and then dawning recognition, were exactly the same shade of hazel that I saw every morning in my own mirror. His face went pale. His hand gripped the doorframe as though he needed it to remain standing. And when he spoke, his voice cracked on a name I had never heard him say before. "Those eyes," he whispered. "Karen, is that really you?" Harold stood frozen in the doorway, his weathered face transforming before my eyes as recognition settled into certainty. Tears began streaming down his cheeks, carving paths through the lines that decades of grief had etched into his skin. He did not speak. He did not need to. The emotion pouring from him said everything that words could not express. Without taking his eyes off my face, he reached slowly into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, its surface cracked and softened from years of handling. His fingers trembled as he opened it and extracted a small photograph. The image was faded and creased, the edges worn soft from what must have been countless moments of being held, examined, mourned over. He turned it toward me, and I found myself looking at a little girl around 2 years old with bright, curious hazel eyes and a tentative smile that seemed to be waiting for permission to bloom fully. It was me. A version of me so young I had no memory of her existence, captured in a moment before the world taught her she was unwanted. "I've carried this every single day since your mother took you from me," Harold whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Every single day for 40 years. I always hoped, I always prayed that somehow, someday—" He could not finish the sentence. Emotion overwhelmed him completely, and he stood there in his doorway, this stranger who was my father, weeping openly without shame or restraint. I stepped forward without conscious decision, my body moving before my mind could catch up. And then I was in his arms, pressed against his chest, held by a father who actually wanted to hold me. The sensation was so foreign, so completely outside my experience, that for a moment I did not know how to respond. I had never been embraced like this by a parent. I had never felt the fierce, protective desperation in someone's grip that told me I was precious, that I mattered, that I was loved beyond measure simply for existing. I do not know how long we stood there crying in each other's arms. Time lost all meaning in that doorway, measured only in tears and trembling, and the gradual release of decades of pain. When we finally pulled apart, both of us wiping our eyes and laughing shakily at the intensity of the moment, Dorothy had disappeared back to her own house, giving us privacy for a reunion she must have understood was sacred. Harold led me inside his home, and we sat together in his small, comfortable living room for hours while he told me his story. He had been young when he met Margaret. He explained both of them working at the same manufacturing company in entry-level positions. She was married, but unhappy, beautiful, and sharp-tongued, and dissatisfied with a husband she described as boring and passionless. Harold was single, ambitious, drawn to her fire and her wit. The affair was brief but intense, a few months of stolen moments that Harold had known even then were wrong, but had been unable to resist. When Margaret discovered she was pregnant, everything changed. She initially told Harold she planned to leave Richard, that she wanted to build a life with him, that their child would be raised by parents who actually loved each other. Harold was terrified, but elated. He began making plans, looking for better jobs, saving every penny he could scrape together for the family he believed they would become. But then Margaret went silent. She stopped returning his calls. She avoided him at work. When he finally confronted her, demanding to know what had changed, her answer was brutally simple. She had discovered the truth about Harold's financial situation. His family was struggling, buried in debt from his father's failed business venture. Richard Douglas, meanwhile, came from comfortable wealth, a family with connections and resources, and a name that meant something in their community. Margaret had done the calculation and decided that money and status mattered more than love. She chose to stay with Richard and pass the baby off as his. Harold was to disappear and never speak of their relationship again. Harold refused at first. He threatened to tell Richard everything, to fight for custody, to drag Margaret through the courts if necessary. But Margaret was not a woman who accepted defiance. She threatened to destroy him completely. She would tell everyone he was a predator who had taken advantage of her. She would accuse him of harassment, of stalking, of crimes that would end his career and his freedom. She had connections he could never match, lawyers who would bury him in legal fees he could not afford. And she offered him a deal that she framed as mercy. "Take $50,000, she said, enough to start fresh somewhere else, to build a new life, to forget about the daughter he would never be allowed to know." The money was supposed to be for Karen's future, Margaret claimed, though Harold doubted a single cent ever reached me. Sign the agreement, walk away, and maybe someday their daughter would seek him out on her own terms. Refuse, and Margaret would burn his life to the ground. "I took the money," Harold admitted, his voice thick with shame. "I was young and scared, and I had nothing. She had everything, all the power, all the advantages. I convinced myself that Karen would have a better life with them, that I would only make things worse by fighting a battle I couldn't win." He paused, and I noticed something in his expression that gave me pause. His eyes shifted briefly away from mine when he spoke about giving up, as though there was more to the story that he was not yet ready to share. But I was too overwhelmed by everything I had already learned to press him further. The full truth, whatever it was, could wait. Harold led me down a hallway to a small room I had assumed was a guest bedroom. But when he opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. The walls were covered with photographs of children at various ages, girls with hazel eyes and brown hair, images clearly cut from magazines and catalogs. There were birthday cards he had written but never sent, addressed to ages I had long since passed. There was a shelf of small gifts still in their packaging, things he had bought over the years without anyone to give them to. This was not a guest room. This was a shrine to the daughter he had lost, a physical manifestation of 4 decades of hoping and praying that someday I would find my way back to him. "I never stopped believing you would come," Harold said quietly from the doorway. "Not once, not for a single day." We returned to the living room, both of us emotionally drained, but unable to stop talking, stop sharing, stop trying to compress 40 years of absence into a single afternoon. But eventually Harold's expression shifted, becoming nervous in a way I had not seen from him before. He took my hands in his and looked at me with a mixture of joy and apprehension. "Karen, there's something else you should know," he said carefully. "You're not an only child. After everything that happened with your mother, I eventually met someone else. Patricia, my late wife. We had 2 children together, Michael and Sarah. They're adults now, and they've always known about you." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "They want to meet you. But I should warn you, Sarah might not be immediately welcoming. She's protective of me, and she's worried you might not be who you say you are." The week between my first meeting with Harold and my introduction to his other children felt like the longest 7 days of my life. I returned home in a daze of conflicting emotions, trying to process everything I had learned while simultaneously preparing myself for what was to come. Noah listened to every detail with wide eyes, asking questions I could not always answer, sharing my anger at the injustices that had shaped our family. Lily, too young to understand the full picture, simply knew that Mommy had found someone important, and that our family might be getting bigger. Her innocent excitement was a balm against the darker thoughts that plagued me in the quiet hours of the night. When the day finally arrived, I drove back to Harold's house with a stomach full of butterflies and a heart full of hope tempered by fear. Harold had warned me about Sarah, his daughter, from his marriage to Patricia. She was protective, he said, skeptical by nature, and she had spent years watching her father carry the weight of a loss she could never fully understand. She might not welcome me with open arms. She might question my motives, my identity, my very right to claim a place in their family. I told myself I was prepared for resistance, but nothing could truly prepare me for the moment I walked through Harold's door and saw the suspicion in Sarah Mitchell's eyes. Michael was easier. Harold's son was in his early 30s with his father's kind eyes and an open, trusting face that immediately put me at ease. He crossed the room the moment I entered, shook my hand firmly, and then pulled me into a hug that caught me completely off guard. "I've always wanted a big sister," he said with a grin that was impossible not to return. "Dad's talked about you my whole life. I feel like I already know you." Sarah was another matter entirely. She stood near the window with her arms crossed over her chest, her posture rigid with defensive tension. She was perhaps a year or 2 younger than Michael, attractive in a severe way with sharp features and eyes that assessed me with the cool calculation of someone who had learned to be wary of strangers bearing gifts. She did not approach me. She did not smile. She simply watched as her brother welcomed me like a long-lost family member, and I could feel her judgment pressing against me like a physical force. We sat down in Harold's living room, the 4 of us arranged in a configuration that felt more like a negotiation than a family reunion. Harold looked nervous, his eyes darting between his daughters as though afraid of what might be said. Michael maintained his easy warmth, but even he seemed aware of the tension radiating from his sister. I folded my hands in my lap and waited, knowing that whatever came next would determine whether I had found a new family or merely another source of rejection. Sarah spoke first, her voice clipped and businesslike. "I'm sorry if this sounds harsh," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "But we've only just met you. How do we know this isn't some kind of scam? Dad has money. He's getting older, and suddenly his long-lost daughter appears out of nowhere with a sad story and expectations." She shook her head. "I've seen enough true crime documentaries to know how this usually ends." The words stung, but beneath my hurt, I recognized something I understood intimately. Sarah was protecting her father. She was doing exactly what I would do if a stranger appeared claiming to be Noah's secret sibling, demanding a place in our lives based on nothing but words and emotion. Her suspicion was not cruelty. It was love expressed as vigilance. I could not fault her for that, even if it felt like a door being slammed in my face. Harold began to speak, his tone conciliatory, clearly wanting to smooth things over before the conflict escalated. But I held up my hand to stop him. This was my battle to fight my truth to prove. If Sarah and I were ever going to have a real relationship, it had to start with honesty and evidence, not with her father playing peacemaker between us. I reached into my bag and pulled out the documents I had brought specifically for this moment. The paternity test with Richard Douglas's name marked as excluded, the settlement agreement bearing Margaret's signature, and Harold's witnessed by a lawyer whose name I now knew had been paid handsomely for his discretion. My grandmother Eleanor's journal filled with decades of observations and confessions, and photographs of myself as a child, images that clearly matched the worn picture Harold had carried in his wallet for 40 years. I spread these items on the coffee table between us and looked directly at Sarah. "I didn't come here for money," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. "I didn't even know your father existed until 2 weeks ago. My entire life I believed I was unwanted, unloved, a burden that my family wished had never been born. I came here because I just found out that wasn't true. I don't need anything from any of you except the truth. If you look at these documents and still think I'm running a scam, I'll walk out that door and never bother you again." Sarah studied the papers with the careful attention of someone accustomed to analyzing evidence. She examined the paternity test, compared the childhood photographs to the one her father had shown her countless times over the years, read passages from Eleanor's journal with furrowed brows. The room was silent except for the rustling of pages and the tick of a clock on the mantel. When she finally looked up, something had shifted in her expression. The suspicion remained, but it had been joined by something else. Doubt, and perhaps the beginning of belief. Before Sarah could speak, Harold cleared his throat. "There's something else you should all know," he said quietly. "Something I haven't told Karen yet." He looked at me with an expression of apology and concern. 5 years ago, someone else contacted me asking about Karen, someone from your family. My heart stopped. "Who?" "Your sister," Harold said. "Jessica. She somehow discovered the family secret and reached out to me. She wanted to know if you were really my daughter. I confirmed the truth. I begged her to tell you to finally end the lies that had kept us apart for so long." He paused, his face darkening with old anger. "But then she went silent. She never contacted me again, and she apparently never told you anything." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Jessica had known. For 5 years, my sister had known the truth about my parentage, about the father who wanted me, about the lies that had shaped my entire existence. And she had said nothing. She had watched me struggle, watched me suffer, watched me search for answers I did not even know existed, and she had kept her silence. Harold continued, his voice heavy. "Shortly after Jessica contacted me, your mother showed up at my door with a lawyer. She threatened legal action if I ever tried to reach out to you. Said she would accuse me of harassment, stalking anything she could think of to destroy me. She was tying up loose ends, making sure the secret stayed buried forever." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process this new layer of betrayal. But it was Sarah who spoke next, and her voice had completely transformed. Gone was the suspicion, the cool assessment, the protective hostility. In its place was something that looked remarkably like righteous anger on my behalf. "Your own sister knew for 5 years and kept it from you," Sarah demanded, "and your mother threatened my father to keep him away from his own daughter." She shook her head slowly, then extended her hand toward me. "I'm sorry I doubted you. Welcome to the family, Karen, and let's make sure those people pay for what they've done." Sarah's handshake marked a turning point that I could feel in my bones. In the span of a single afternoon, I had gone from being a suspicious stranger to a welcomed member of a family I had never known existed. Michael embraced me again, his warmth now joined by his sister's tentative but genuine acceptance. Harold watched us with tears streaming down his face, decades of hope finally crystallizing into reality. For a few precious moments, we simply sat together in his living room, 4 people connected by blood and circumstance, beginning the slow process of becoming a family. But Harold was not content to leave things there. Over the following days, he made phone calls and arranged meetings, determined to formalize my place in his life in every way possible. 2 weeks after my introduction to Sarah and Michael, I found myself sitting in a law office I had never imagined entering, surrounded by people who were rapidly becoming the family I had always craved. Mr. Patterson was Harold's estate attorney, a silver-haired man in his 60s who had been managing the Mitchell family's legal affairs for over 30 years. His office was lined with law books and framed degrees, the trappings of a career built on meticulous attention to detail and unwavering ethical standards. He shook my hand with professional courtesy when Harold introduced us. but I caught the curiosity in his eyes as he examined the woman his longtime client had spoken about with such longing for so many years. Harold wasted no time explaining why he had arranged this meeting. He wanted to add me to his will as a primary beneficiary, giving me an equal share alongside Sarah and Michael. The declaration should have shocked me, but somehow it did not. Harold Mitchell was a man who had spent 40 years regretting his inability to provide for his firstborn daughter. Now that I had finally found my way back to him, he was determined to make up for lost time in every way available to him. What did surprise me was the reaction from Sarah and Michael. I expected resistance or at least hesitation. Instead, both of them voiced immediate support for their father's decision. Michael simply nodded and said it was the right thing to do. Sarah, whose initial suspicion had transformed into fierce protectiveness, declared that I deserved compensation for the lifetime of love I had been denied. Their generosity overwhelmed me, these siblings I had known for mere weeks, offering to share their inheritance with a stranger who shared only half their blood. But Mr. Patterson raised a concern that none of us had considered. He leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave with professional caution. "I understand the sentiment behind this decision," he said carefully, "and I have no legal objection to adding Karen to Harold's will. However, I need to advise you all of a potential complication." He explained that if I were to stake any claim on the Mitchell estate while the Douglas family situation remained unresolved, Margaret and her lawyers could use it as evidence that my motives were purely financial. They could argue that I had manufactured a relationship with Harold specifically to gain access to his assets, that my entire story was an elaborate scheme to defraud multiple families simultaneously. It would not matter that the accusation was false. The mere suggestion could undermine any legal case I might bring against the Douglas family, painting me as a gold digger rather than a victim of decades-long fraud. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Harold looked stricken, his attempt to provide for me potentially becoming a weapon his enemies could use against us. Sarah's jaw tightened with frustration at the injustice of a system that seemed designed to protect the guilty. Michael simply shook his head, muttering something about lawyers and loopholes that I did not quite catch. Mr. Patterson continued, shifting the conversation toward what he called the real legal battleground. If I wanted to challenge my exclusion from the Douglas Family Trust, specifically the irrevocable trust my grandmother Eleanor had apparently established before her death, I would need concrete evidence of fraud. The documents I had gathered were compelling but circumstantial. A paternity test and a settlement agreement proved that I was Harold's daughter and that Margaret had paid to keep him away, but they did not directly demonstrate that the trust had been illegally modified. To build a solid case, Mr. Patterson explained, I would need 3 things. First, proof that my grandmother's original trust had named me as a beneficiary. Second, evidence that the trust had been illegally modified after Eleanor's death, which would constitute fraud since irrevocable trusts cannot be legally changed once the grantor dies. Third, documentation of the broader financial fraud involving the custodial accounts that should have held money for me and the payments Harold had made that I never received. The good news, he said, was that fraud cases involving trusts had no statute of limitations in our state. It did not matter that these crimes had been committed decades ago. If I could prove them, the perpetrators could still be held accountable. The bad news was that proving them would be a long, difficult fight against opponents who had far more resources and far fewer scruples than I possessed. I listened to Mr. Patterson's explanation with growing resolve. When he finished, I looked around the room at the faces of my new family people who had known me for mere weeks, but who were already prepared to stand beside me in a battle that was not their own. I thought about Noah and Lily waiting for me at home, about the lessons I wanted to teach them about standing up for yourself even when the odds seemed impossible. I didn't come here looking for money, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. I came looking for the truth. But now that I know what my mother did, not just to me but to Harold, to my grandmother's wishes, to everyone she touched, I can't let it stand. I paused, gathering my thoughts into words that would convey the full weight of my conviction. This isn't about enriching myself. This is about justice. It's about making sure the people who systematically destroyed my life face consequences for what they did. It's about honoring my grandmother Eleanor, who spent her final years trying to protect me and whose wishes were violated the moment she died. And most of all, it's about showing my children that you don't have to accept being treated like you're worthless, that you can fight back, that the truth matters. Mr. Patterson studied me for a long moment, his experienced eyes assessing my resolve. Then he nodded slowly, a small smile crossing his professional demeanor. "Then let's build your case," he said. "We'll need every piece of evidence we can find, every document, every witness, every trail your mother tried to bury." I felt my jaw set with determination as I looked around at my new family. Harold, Sarah, Michael, and now Mr. Patterson, all of them prepared to help me fight a battle I had never known I needed to wage. And suddenly I remembered something from my grandmother's journal, a passage I had read but not fully understood at the time. "I know exactly where to start," I said, my mind racing with possibilities. My grandmother mentioned something in her journal, a video she recorded for when the truth needs to come out. She wrote that she hid it where Margaret could never reach it. I paused, feeling the pieces begin to fall into place, and I think I know exactly where she put it. Before I could search for my grandmother's hidden video, I needed to do something that logic advised against, but my heart demanded. I needed to confront my mother. Mr. Patterson would have counseled patience, would have warned me not to tip my hand before the legal case was fully prepared. But there was a part of me, the wounded child who had spent 42 years wondering why she was unworthy of love, that needed answers no document could provide. I needed to hear from Margaret's own lips why she had done what she did. I needed to understand the mind of the woman who had treated me as disposable from the moment I was born. I drove to the Douglas house on a gray February afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain, but never delivered. I did not call ahead. I did not give warning. I simply parked in the driveway of my childhood prison and walked up to the front door with a heart full of questions and a soul braced for cruelty. Margaret answered my knock with an expression of mild annoyance that transformed instantly into something far more hostile when she saw who stood on her doorstep. Her face hardened into stone, and she immediately moved to close the door in my face. But I was faster, placing my hand against the wood and pushing forward with strength I did not know I possessed. The door swung open, and I stepped across the threshold into the house where I had learned that love could be conditional, that family could be a weapon that some mothers view their children as burdens rather than blessings. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "And this time, you're going to tell me the truth." Margaret's face twisted with contempt, so pure it seemed to radiate from her like heat from a furnace. "You have no right to barge into my home," she hissed, retreating into the foyer but making no move to physically remove me. "Whatever lies you think you've discovered, they change nothing. You've always been nothing but a problem, Karen. A problem I've been dealing with for over 40 years. Why?" The question erupted from me before I could stop it, carrying decades of pain in a single syllable. "Why did you hate me my whole life? What did I ever do to you? I was a child, your child, and you treated me like garbage from the day I was born. I need to know why." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. The controlled mask of contempt began to crack, revealing something raw and ugly beneath. Years of suppressed resentment, carefully contained behind walls of cold indifference, suddenly came flooding out like poison from a lanced wound. She began to speak, and her words were more devastating than anything I had imagined. "Because you ruined my life," she spat, her voice rising with each phrase. "You were supposed to be my ticket out of this miserable marriage, my leverage to start over with Harold. I was going to leave Richard take you, build something real with someone I actually wanted. But then Harold turned out to be poor, struggling, worthless. And Richard found out about the affair before I could make my escape." She laughed bitterly. "Suddenly you weren't an asset anymore. You were evidence. Evidence of the biggest mistake I ever made." I stood frozen, absorbing the impact of her confession. She had never wanted me for myself. She had wanted me as a bargaining chip, a tool to manipulate the men in her life. When that plan fell apart, I became nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of her failed schemes. Margaret continued her cruelty, building momentum like a boulder rolling downhill. I wanted to get rid of you before you were even born. Did you know that I made inquiries, looked into options? But I couldn't afford it, not without Richard finding out, not without exposing everything. So I was stuck with you. She said the last words with such venom that I physically flinched. Stuck with a constant reminder of everything I sacrificed, everything I lost, everything I could have had if you had never existed. Every time I looked at you, I saw my own failure staring back at me. The words should have destroyed me. Perhaps once they would have. But something had changed in the weeks since Christmas, since Noah's revelation, since finding Harold, and learning that I had been loved all along by people who were forbidden to show it. Margaret's hatred finally spoken aloud after decades of being expressed through cold silences and casual cruelties could not touch the foundation of self-worth I had begun to build. I forced myself to remain composed, to push past the pain toward the information I actually needed. "What about Harold?" I asked. "What about the money he paid you? What about the trust you tampered with after Grandma Eleanor died?" Margaret's eyes narrowed at the mention of her mother-in-law. "Harold was pathetic," she sneered. "He thought he could just walk into your life after all those years. Thought he could play the devoted father when he had already signed away his rights. I made sure he understood that would never happen. I made sure he knew exactly what I would do to him if he ever tried to contact you again." She was so focused on her own righteousness that she did not notice the figure appearing in the doorway behind her. But I did. Richard Douglas stood there in rumpled clothes, his face pale and haggard, looking like a man who had not slept properly in weeks. He was listening to every word his wife said, and his expression was transforming before my eyes into something I had never seen on his face before. Disgust. Pure, undiluted disgust. "Margaret, enough," he said quietly, his voice cutting through her tirade like a knife through silk. Margaret whirled to face him, her expression shifting from cruel triumph to defensive anger. "Stay out of this, Richard. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me more than anyone," Richard replied, stepping fully into the room. "I've listened to you justify what we did for 40 years. I've watched you treat Karen like she was less than human, and I've said nothing because I was too weak to stand up to you. But I can't listen to this anymore." He looked at me then, and his eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. "Can't you see what we've done to her, Margaret? What you've turned us into?" Margaret's face contorted with rage. "What I've turned us into, I saved this family. I protected everything we built, and now you're going to side with her." The argument escalated rapidly, husband and wife hurling accusations at each other while I stood between them, watching the facade of my family's respectability crumble into dust. Margaret screamed about sacrifices Richard never appreciated. Richard shouted about crimes he had been forced to witness and ignore. And in the chaos of their collision, Margaret made a mistake. "You weren't supposed to find that letter," she shrieked at Richard, momentarily forgetting I was there. "Eleanor promised she destroyed everything before she died. She swore to me that she would never tell Karen the truth, that she would take our agreement to her grave." My blood ran cold. "What letter?" I demanded, stepping forward. "What did my grandmother write? What agreement did you have with her?" Margaret never answered my question about the letter. Richard's interruption had derailed her entirely, and their argument spiraled into mutual accusations that seemed to have been building for decades. I stood there watching them tear into each other, two people whose marriage had been built on lies and maintained through complicity, finally crumbling under the weight of secrets that could no longer be contained. At some point, I simply turned and walked out the door. Neither of them noticed me leave. They were too consumed by their own destruction to spare a thought for the daughter whose life they had systematically ruined. I drove home in a state of numbness so profound it frightened me. The confrontation had confirmed everything I feared and more. My mother had never wanted me. She had wanted to abort me but could not afford it. She had viewed me as a failed investment, a reminder of mistakes she wished she could erase. Every cruel word she had spoken throughout my childhood, every cold dismissal, every moment of calculated neglect, had been exactly what it seemed. There was no hidden love waiting to be discovered. There was no explanation that would make the pain worthwhile. My mother simply hated me, had always hated me, would continue to hate me until one of us died. I sat in my dark living room for hours after arriving home, unable to cry, unable to move, unable to do anything but exist in a void of despair so complete it seemed to swallow all light. Noah and Lily were at school giving me solitude I did not want but could not escape. I caught my reflection in the television screen, a ghostly image staring back at me from the black glass, and I barely recognized the woman I saw. Where was the confident mother who had raised 2 children alone? Where was the fighter who had survived a husband's abandonment and rebuilt her life from nothing? She seemed like a distant memory, a character from a story I had once read about someone else's life. For the first time since this journey began, I considered giving up. The thought crept into my mind like poison, seductive in its simplicity. I could walk away from all of this. I could accept that my biological family was toxic beyond redemption and focus on the small family I had built with Noah and Lily. I could let the lawyers fight their battles without me, let the truths stay buried, let the wounds scab over into scars I would carry forever, but never have to examine again. Maybe ignorance really was bliss. Maybe some doors were better left closed. But even as the thought formed, something stirred in my memory. My grandmother's journal. There had been a passage I had skimmed over in my initial reading, a reference to correspondence with Harold that Eleanor had saved. In my desperation to find the video Eleanor had mentioned, I had not examined every document in the collection I had taken from my father's office. Perhaps there was something I had missed, something that would give me the strength to continue, or the permission to stop. I forced myself off the couch and retrieved the folder of documents I had accumulated over the past weeks. I spread them across the floor and began searching methodically, examining each page with eyes that felt raw from unshed tears. And then I found it. A letter I had not fully read, tucked between pages of Eleanor's journal, written in my grandmother's elegant handwriting on paper yellowed with age. The letter was addressed to Harold Mitchell and dated when I would have been 10 years old. Eleanor wrote that she could no longer stand by and watch Karen suffer in a home where she was clearly unloved. She offered to help Harold fight for custody. She would testify in court that Margaret was emotionally abusive, that Karen was being systematically neglected, that the child's well-being was at risk. She begged Harold to take action to finally claim the daughter he had been forced to abandon, to give Karen the loving home she deserved. Attached to Eleanor's letter was Harold's response. I read his words with growing horror, each sentence a fresh wound opening in my already battered heart. "I cannot take this risk," Harold had written. "I have a wife now, young children of my own. Patricia knows about Karen, but she has accepted the situation as it is. Bringing Karen into our lives would disrupt everything we have built. It would confuse Sarah and Michael, complicate our marriage, force us to upend our entire existence for a child I barely know. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I want to help, but I have to think of my current family. Perhaps when Karen is older, when my children are grown, things will be different. But for now, I cannot be the father you want me to be." I stared at the letter, feeling my heart break all over again. Harold Mitchell, the father. I had begun to trust the man who had wept with joy at our reunion and claimed he had never stopped loving me had been given a chance to save me when I was 10 years old. Eleanor had offered him a path, had been willing to risk everything to help him gain custody, had seen clearly that I was suffering and needed rescue. And Harold had said no. He had chosen his comfortable life over his firstborn daughter. He had abandoned me not once, but twice, and the second time he had done it with full knowledge of what I was enduring. I do not know when the tears finally came, At some point, the dam I had built inside myself simply collapsed, and decades of grief came flooding out in waves that shook my entire body. I was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers, when Noah and Lily came home from school. They found me there, their mother reduced to a sobbing wreck amid the wreckage of everything she thought she knew. Noah knelt beside me without a word and picked up Harold's letter. I watched his young face as he read, watched understanding dawn alongside anger. But instead of joining my despair, he did something that reminded me why I had fought so hard to raise him right. "Mom, look at me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This letter was written 15 years ago. Harold was younger then, scared, trying to protect a family he had already built. People make mistakes. What matters is what happens now, not what happened then." Before I could respond, Lily climbed into my lap with the simple determination of a 6-year-old who sees her mother hurting and knows only one response. She wrapped her small arms around my neck and pressed her cheek against mine. "I love you, Mommy," she whispered. "You're the best mommy in the whole world." I held my children against me, feeling their warmth seep into the cold places that despair had created. Noah was right. The letter was old, written by a younger man in different circumstances, and Lily was right too, in her innocent way. I was a good mother. I had built something real and precious with these two human beings who loved me unconditionally. They were my true family. They always had been. For them, I would find the strength to finish what I had started. I wiped my tears and reached for the small USB drive that had been hidden in Eleanor's journal, the one thing I had not yet examined. "Whatever is on here," I said to Noah, my voice rough but determined, "it's going to change everything. Grandma Eleanor made sure of it. Are you ready?" Noah nodded solemnly. I plugged the drive into my laptop and held my breath. The laptop screen flickered to life and the USB drive revealed its contents. A single video file. Nothing else, dated 3 months before my grandmother Eleanor's death. I stared at the file name for a long moment, aware that Noah was watching over my shoulder, aware that whatever this recording contained would likely change the course of everything that followed. My finger hovered over the trackpad, trembling slightly with anticipation and fear. Then I pressed play. My grandmother's face filled the screen and my breath caught in my throat. She was older than I remembered, her hair fully silver, her skin papery and pale with the unmistakable pallor of someone fighting a losing battle with illness. But her eyes were exactly as I remembered them, warm and knowing and filled with a love that had never wavered even when circumstances forced her to hide it. She was sitting in what I recognized as her living room, the same room where she had read me stories as a child, where she had held me when I cried, where she had been the only person in my family who made me feel like I mattered. "Karen, my dear girl," Eleanor began, her voice thin but steady. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and you've finally discovered the truth. I prayed this day would come, even as I feared I wouldn't live to see it." She paused, and I saw tears glistening in her aged eyes. "I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you myself. I was afraid, terrified of what Margaret would do if she knew I was working against her. I was afraid of losing access to you and Jessica, of being cut off from the only grandchildren I would ever have. My fear kept me silent when I should have spoken. I will carry that guilt into whatever comes next." She took a shaky breath and continued, "But I refuse to let my fear protect the wicked forever. Margaret has done terrible things, Karen. Things you deserve to know, things that can be proven. What you're about to see is my insurance policy recorded without Margaret's knowledge or consent. In our state, I had every legal right to record conversations in my own home. This footage is admissible in court. It is my gift to you, my weapon against the woman who stole your birthright and tried to erase you from existence." The video shifted abruptly, cutting to a different recording with a clearly different quality. The camera angle was slightly off position, somewhere high and partially hidden, capturing a wide view of Eleanor's living room from an odd perspective. I realized my grandmother must have set up a hidden camera, perhaps in a bookshelf or behind a decorative item, waiting for the right moment to capture her daughter-in-law's true nature. Margaret appeared on screen, standing near the fireplace with her arms crossed over her chest. She looked younger than she did now, but her expression of cold contempt was exactly the same. Eleanor sat in her armchair, visibly frail but radiating a quiet determination that I recognized from my own reflection in recent weeks. "I know what you did, Margaret," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "I know about Harold. I know about the money you took from him and kept for yourself instead of putting it aside for Karen. I know about the trust changes you've been planning, the documents you've been preparing to alter after I die." Margaret's face contorted with rage, but instead of denying the accusations, she did something that made my blood run cold. She laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound, the laugh of someone who believed themselves untouchable. "So what if you know?" Margaret sneered. "What are you going to do about it, old woman? Tell Richard? He's known for years and he's too weak to do anything. Tell Karen she'll never believe you over me. I've spent her whole life making sure she knows exactly how worthless she is." She stepped closer to Eleanor, her posture aggressive and intimidating. "Yes, I manipulated Harold. He was easy, a lovesick fool who thought his feelings mattered. I took his money, and I made sure he understood that he would never ever be part of Karen's life. I forged the documents to remove Karen from your precious trust because she doesn't deserve a single penny of this family's wealth. She's not even Richard's daughter. She's nothing." "She's my granddaughter," Eleanor said quietly. "She's innocent of everything you blame her for." "She's evidence of my worst mistake," Margaret spat back. "And I've been siphoning money from the accounts you set up in her name for years. Every dollar you tried to give her, I took. Every gift, every inheritance, every scrap of financial security you tried to provide, I redirected to where it actually belonged. And there's nothing you can do about it." She leaned down, putting her face close to Eleanor's. "You're dying, old woman. Everyone knows it. In a few months you'll be gone and all your precious plans will die with you. Karen will never know the truth. She'll spend her whole life believing she's worthless, just like I taught her. And I'll finally be free of your constant meddling." The video cut back to Eleanor now, alone, clearly recorded, shortly after Margaret's departure. The old woman's face was set with grim determination, but there was also triumph in her eyes. "You heard her confession," Eleanor said to the camera. "Trust fraud, document forgery, embezzlement from accounts meant for a child. All of it admitted in her own words, in her own voice, recorded legally in my own home." She leaned forward slightly. "Karen, I need you to know that after recording this, I contacted Harold. I told him about this video and gave him instructions for a failsafe, something to help you if you ever needed it. He has a key that belongs to you." Eleanor continued explaining that years ago, when she first began to suspect the depth of Margaret's machinations, she had quietly purchased a small property and put it solely in my name through a legal mechanism that Margaret had never discovered. The house was mine, free and clear, protected from any claims the Douglas family might make. Inside it, Eleanor had stored everything she could not give me while she was alive. "The key is with Harold," Eleanor said. "He's kept it safe for all these years, waiting for the day when you might need it. Go to that house, Karen. Find what I left for you. And know this, my darling girl." Her voice broke with emotion. "You were never unwanted. You were never worthless. You were stolen from the people who loved you by a woman who saw you as nothing more than an inconvenience. Now take back what's yours. Take back your inheritance, your dignity, your rightful place in this family. I love you, Karen. I always have. And I always will." The video ended, leaving me staring at a black screen while tears poured down my cheeks. Noah sat beside me in stunned silence, processing what we had just witnessed. My grandmother had been fighting for me all along, preparing weapons I would not discover until years after her death. She had loved me fiercely, protected me secretly, and left me the tools to finally claim justice. I reached for my phone and dialed Mr. Patterson's number with shaking hands. When he answered, I did not bother with pleasantries. "I have video evidence of my mother admitting to trust fraud, document forgery, and financial crimes," I said. "She confessed everything on camera. It's all on tape, recorded legally by my grandmother before she died." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mr. Patterson spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made my stomach clench with sudden dread. "Karen, this is extraordinary news. This changes everything about our case." Another pause. "But you need to know something. I just received notification an hour ago. Your mother has hired her own lawyers, a very aggressive firm. She's claiming you've been harassing her, making threats, trying to extort money from elderly parents. She's filing a countersuit against you for elder abuse." The news of Margaret's countersuit should have been my primary concern, but there was something I needed to address before any legal battle could move forward. The letter Harold had written 15 years ago still burned in my memory, its words seared into my consciousness like a brand. I could not build a case for justice while carrying unresolved anger toward one of the few people who claimed to love me. I needed to confront Harold about his choice, needed to understand how he could have abandoned me twice, needed to know if the father I had begun to trust was worthy of that trust at all. I drove to his house the next morning with Eleanor's letter tucked into my purse, like evidence for a trial I was about to conduct. Harold greeted me at the door with his usual warmth, but something in my expression must have warned him that this was not a social visit. His smile faltered as he led me inside, and when I pulled the letter from my bag and placed it on the coffee table between us, his face crumbled like a building collapsing inward. He did not try to make excuses. He did not attempt to deflect blame or minimize what he had done. He simply stared at the letter at his own handwriting from 15 years ago, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were filled with an anguish so profound it seemed to age him another decade in a matter of seconds. "I was a coward," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor gave me a chance to save you, and I refused. I told myself I was protecting my family, protecting Patricia and Sarah and Michael from the disruption that bringing you into our lives would cause. But the truth is, I was protecting myself." He took a shuddering breath. "I was afraid of the fight, afraid of losing the comfortable life I had built, afraid of facing Margaret and her lawyers and her threats. So I chose the easy path. I chose to let you suffer rather than risk my own stability." He looked at me with eyes swimming in tears. "And I've regretted it every single day since. Every birthday you had that I wasn't part of. Every Christmas morning I spent with Sarah and Michael while wondering what you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you even knew I existed. The guilt has been my constant companion for 15 years, Karen. It's eaten away at me like a disease I couldn't cure." I sat in silence processing his confession, feeling the familiar surge of anger that had become my default response to betrayal. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to rage against yet another person who had failed me when I needed them most. Part of me wanted to walk out that door and never look back, to add Harold to the list of family members who had chosen their own comfort over my well-being. But another part of me, the part shaped by years of raising Noah and Lily through difficult times, understood something that my anger wanted to deny. People were complicated. They made terrible choices for reasons that seemed justified in the moment. They lived with consequences they could never fully escape. Harold was flawed, deeply flawed. He had made a decision that caused me immeasurable harm. But unlike Margaret, who had doubled down on her cruelty at every opportunity, Harold seemed genuinely tortured by what he had done. His remorse was not a performance. It was a wound that had never healed. "I could hate you for this," I finally said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. "I would be justified in walking out that door and never speaking to you again." Harold nodded slowly, accepting whatever verdict I was about to deliver. He did not plead or bargain or try to change my mind. He simply waited, prepared to lose the daughter he had only just found, if that was what justice demanded. "But I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who couldn't admit they were wrong," I continued. "People who doubled down on their cruelty rather than face themselves. You're not one of those people, Harold. You made a terrible mistake and you've lived with the guilt for decades. That doesn't erase what you did, but it tells me something important about who you are." I paused, fighting back tears that threatened to overwhelm me. "I forgive you. Not because what you did was okay, because it wasn't. but because holding on to this anger won't give me back the childhood I lost. And because I finally have a chance to have a father, and I don't want to throw that away over something that can't be changed." Harold broke down, completely sobbing with an intensity I had never witnessed in a grown man. His shoulders shook, his face contorted with released emotion, and I realized I was watching decades of guilt finally finding an outlet. When he finally composed himself, wiping his eyes with trembling hands, he looked at me with fierce determination. "I will spend whatever time I have left making this right," he promised. "Starting with helping you win this case. Your grandmother gave me something for you, something I've kept safe for 17 years. He rose and retrieved a small ornate key from a locked drawer. "This opens the house Eleanor left you. She said it holds everything you need to destroy Margaret's lies forever." He pressed the key into my palm, then held my hands in both of his. "But Eleanor also gave me a warning. She said if you open this door, you can never close it again. What you find inside will show you what your mother truly is in ways you might not be prepared for." His eyes searched mine. "Are you ready, Karen?" I held the ornate key in my hand for 2 days, turning it over and over while I gathered the courage to use it. But before I could make the drive to Eleanor's secret house, my phone rang with a number I never expected to see. Jessica. My sister, the golden child, the favored daughter who had known my truth for 5 years and kept it buried. Her voice, when I answered, was nothing like the confident, slightly condescending tone I had grown accustomed to over decades of strained interactions. She sounded nervous, almost frightened. "Karen, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "In person. Alone. Please." Every instinct told me to refuse. Jessica had watched me suffer my entire life without lifting a finger to help. She had known the truth about Harold and chosen silence. She had benefited from Margaret's favoritism while I scraped by on scraps of acknowledgement. But something in her voice, a tremor of genuine fear that I had never heard from my composed sister, made me agree to meet her. The coffee shop she suggested was neutral territory, far from our parents' neighborhood and the prying eyes of people who might recognize us. When I arrived, I almost did not recognize the woman waiting at a corner table. Jessica had always been immaculate, perfectly styled hair and designer clothes, and makeup applied with surgical precision. The person sitting before me looked exhausted, anxious, somehow older than her 38 years. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and her hands shook slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. She slid an envelope across the table before I had even sat down. "I should have given you this 5 years ago," she said, her voice cracking. "I've been a coward, just like everyone else in this family. I'm so sorry, Karen." I did not touch the envelope immediately. I needed to hear her explanation first, needed to understand how she could have maintained her silence while watching me drown in lies. Jessica seemed to understand. She took a deep breath and began talking, the words tumbling out as though a dam had finally broken. She had discovered the truth 5 years ago, she explained when she accidentally overheard our parents arguing late one night. Margaret had been drinking, her tongue loosened by wine, and she had said things about Karen, about Harold, about money and documents and decades of deception. Jessica had been horrified. She confronted Harold, secretly wanting to understand, and he had confirmed everything. He begged her to tell me to finally end the lies that had poisoned our family for so long. But when Jessica confronted Margaret, our mother had transformed into something terrifying. She threatened to disown Jessica completely, to cut her off from every financial support and family connection, to destroy her the same way she had destroyed me. Jessica, raised to depend on that support, raised to believe her worth came from Margaret's approval, had crumbled under the pressure. "I've hated myself every day since," Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. "I watched them treat you like garbage my whole life, and I never said anything because I was terrified of becoming the next target. I was a coward. I chose comfort over conscience, and you paid the price." I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She was not the enemy I had imagined. She was another victim shaped by the same toxic household that had damaged me, just molded into a different form. Margaret had turned us against each other, and we had both lost. The envelope contained bank statements and financial records Jessica had secretly copied from our father's office. The documents revealed systematic theft spanning decades' money from Harold redirected into Margaret's accounts. Funds from Eleanor's gifts siphoned away before they could reach me. My own custodial account drained for purposes I had never authorized. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. But Jessica had also discovered something more urgent. Margaret had been hiding a serious heart condition for the past year. Her health was failing faster than anyone knew, and she was accelerating her schemes in response, trying to liquidate assets and transfer everything to accounts I could never touch. She believed she was running out of time and was determined to complete her theft before the end came. "If you don't act soon," Jessica warned, "there might be nothing left to claim. She's moving money every day, hiding it in places even Dad doesn't know about." I realized then that this was no longer just about justice or closure. It was a race against time, against a dying woman's desperate final betrayal. As I rose to leave, Jessica grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "There's one more thing," she said, her eyes fierce with newfound resolve. "I'm done being their pawn. I'm going to testify against them, against both of them in court. I'm going to tell a jury exactly what I've seen and heard over the past 40 years. Her grip tightened. "Mom is going to lose everything, and for once in my life I'm going to be on the right side." Jessica's evidence proved to be the key that unlocked 4 decades of financial deception. Within a week of receiving her documents, Mr. Patterson had assembled a team that included a forensic accountant specializing in family trust fraud. They worked around the clock, tracing money through accounts and shell corporations and investment vehicles that Margaret had used to hide her theft. What they uncovered left even the experienced professionals stunned. Over the course of 40 years, Margaret had systematically stolen more than $400,000 that should have belonged to me. The monthly payments Harold had faithfully sent for years, payments he believed were supporting his daughter, had been intercepted and deposited into Margaret's personal accounts. The custodial account that Eleanor had established when I was born, money that should have been released to me at 21, had been emptied years before I reached adulthood. A significant portion of Eleanor's irrevocable trust funds that were legally mine the moment my grandmother died had been fraudulently redirected through forged documents and complicit lawyers. Investment returns from accounts I never knew existed had compounded for decades, all of it funneled away from me and into Margaret's control. The forensic accountant, a stern woman named Dr. Chen, who had testified in dozens of fraud cases, called it one of the most comprehensive cases of familial financial fraud she had ever seen. The documentation was meticulous, the theft methodical, the cover-up sophisticated. Margaret had treated stealing from her own daughter like a professional enterprise, maintaining records that would now serve as evidence of her own crimes. But Margaret was not surrendering without a fight. Her response to our legal preparations came in the form of an aggressive countersuit filed by a high-powered attorney whose reputation for ruthless tactics preceded him. The lawsuit accused me of elder harassment, extortion, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. According to the filing, I had been stalking my elderly mother, threatening her with fabricated accusations, attempting to manipulate a dying woman out of assets that rightfully belonged to her. The suit demanded a restraining order and substantial damages, painting me as the villain in a story where I had always been the victim. I was shocked by the audacity, by the brazenness of claiming victimhood, while decades of theft lay exposed in financial records. But Mr. Patterson remained calm. "This is a common tactic among guilty parties," he explained. "When the evidence is overwhelming, they try to shift the narrative. They're attempting to make you the aggressor so they can claim any testimony against them is tainted by bias. It won't work, but it will make things messier and more expensive." I was still processing this new complication when my phone rang with a call that drove all thoughts of legal strategy from my mind. Sarah's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Harold had collapsed at home and been rushed to the hospital. He was alive but in serious condition. I needed to come immediately. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of fear and desperate prayer. When I arrived, I found Sarah and Michael in the waiting room, their faces pale with worry. A doctor emerged to explain that Harold had advanced heart disease, a condition he had apparently been hiding for years, rather than burden his children with concern. The collapse was a warning sign that his heart was failing faster than anyone had anticipated. He was stable for now, but the prognosis was uncertain at best. They allowed me into his room, and the sight of Harold lying in that hospital bed connected to monitors and IV lines struck me with a grief I had not expected. I had known this man for only weeks, but in that time he had become something I never thought I would have. A father. A real father who loved me, who regretted his failures, who was fighting alongside me for justice. The thought of losing him now, before we had truly begun to build a relationship, was almost unbearable. Harold's eyes opened when I took his hand. He was weak, his skin ashen, but his grip tightened around my fingers with surprising strength. "I was hoping I'd have more time," he whispered. "There's so much I wanted to do, so much I wanted to make up for." I promised him that I would see this through no matter what obstacles Margaret threw in our path. Harold nodded slowly, then made me promise something more. "Whatever happens to me, don't let her win. Not just for you, Karen. For Eleanor. Your grandmother believed in justice her whole life. She prepared everything so you could claim what's rightfully yours. Make sure she gets the victory she deserves." Before I could respond, the phone in Harold's room rang. A nurse answered, then handed it to me with a puzzled expression. Mr. Patterson's voice was urgent when I pressed the receiver to my ear. "Karen, I just got word from the court. Given the medical evidence and witness testimony we've compiled, the judge has agreed to expedite the case. We have a court date in 3 months. He paused, and I could hear the tension in his breath. "But there's a catch. Margaret's lawyers are going to argue that Harold is the real villain. They're going to paint your biological father as a manipulative predator who seduced a married woman and is now using you to extort the family. They're going to put him on trial instead of her." The 3 months leading up to the trial passed in a blur of preparation strategy sessions and anxious nights spent wondering if justice was actually possible against someone as ruthless as my mother. Harold's health stabilized enough for him to leave the hospital, though he remained weak and was forbidden by doctors from testifying in person. His written deposition would have to suffice a fact that Margaret's attorneys seemed eager to exploit. But as I walked into the courtroom on that first day of proceedings, I felt something I had not expected. Calm. Whatever happened in this room, I had already won something that could never be taken away. I knew the truth. I had family who loved me, and I was no longer afraid. The courtroom was packed with observers, reporters who had caught wind of the scandal, and curious locals drawn by rumors of a prominent family's dirty secrets being aired in public. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Mr. Patterson, acutely aware of my support system arranged in the gallery behind me. Sarah and Michael Mitchell sat in the front row, their presence a visible reminder that I was not alone. Noah sat beside them, having insisted on attending despite my concerns. Lily was safe with a trusted friend too young to witness what was about to unfold. Across the aisle, Margaret sat ramrod straight in her chair, her expression carefully composed into one of aggrieved innocence. She wore an elegant black dress, the picture of a dignified elderly woman being persecuted by an ungrateful child. But I noticed cracks in her performance. Her hands gripped her purse too tightly. Her jaw was clenched beneath her serene smile. Beside her, Richard looked like a different man entirely. Gone was the composed, distant figure I had known my whole life. He looked haunted, diminished, his eyes constantly darting toward me with an expression I could not quite interpret. Margaret's attorney, a slick man named Henderson, whose reputation for aggressive tactics was well earned, opened with a narrative designed to destroy my credibility. He painted me as a troubled woman estranged from her family for good reason, who had invented an elaborate conspiracy to steal from aging parents in their twilight years. He spoke of elder abuse, of harassment of a daughter whose greed had transformed normal family disagreements into criminal accusations. By the time he finished, I could see some jurors looking at me with uncertainty. Then Mr. Patterson began presenting our evidence. He started with the documents, laying the foundation methodically. The paternity test that proved Richard was not my biological father. The settlement agreement that showed Margaret had accepted $50,000 to keep Harold away from me. Eleanor's journal with its detailed accounts of suspicions and fears and desperate attempts to protect a granddaughter she loved. The financial records Jessica had provided showing decades of systematic theft, each piece of evidence built upon the last constructing an undeniable picture of fraud and deception. But the moment that changed everything was the video. When Margaret's own voice filled the courtroom, bragging about manipulating Harold, confessing to forging documents, mocking Eleanor's impending death, the atmosphere shifted like a physical force. Jurors who had looked skeptical during Henderson's opening now stared at Margaret with undisguised shock. One woman in the front row covered her mouth with her hand. Margaret's composed facade cracked visibly, her face draining of color as she heard her own words condemning her. Henderson leaped to his feet, objecting furiously, claiming the video was obtained illegally and should be inadmissible. But the judge, a stern woman who had been carefully neutral until now, ruled against him. Eleanor had recorded the conversation in her own home, which was perfectly legal. The evidence stood. The final blow came from a source no one expected. Richard Douglas was called to testify, and everyone in the courtroom assumed he would support his wife, would deny everything, would maintain the lies he had upheld for 40 years. Henderson asked him to confirm that Karen had been harassing the family. Richard was silent for an agonizing moment. Then, instead of answering, he turned to look directly at me. Tears began streaming down his weathered face, carving paths through decades of suppressed guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been too weak to protect you your whole life, but I won't be too weak to tell the truth now." What followed was a complete corroboration of everything I had alleged. The affair, the payoff to Harold, the trust manipulation, the years of theft. Richard confessed it all, while Margaret screamed at him to stop, her composed dignity shattering into rage. The bailiff had to physically restrain her as the courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge called for order and announced a recess. As the room began to clear, Margaret was escorted past my table. She stopped suddenly, her face twisted with desperation, and fell to her knees before me. "Karen, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Don't do this. I'm your mother. Whatever I did it to survive. Please show mercy." I looked down at Margaret kneeling before me, this woman who had made my life a misery for 42 years, now reduced to begging for mercy in a public courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward to help her up, but she waved him away, her eyes locked on mine with desperate intensity. I said nothing. I simply turned and walked away, leaving her on her knees as the courtroom cleared around us. The fallout from Richard's testimony was swift and devastating. Local news stations picked up the story within hours, their headlines screaming across television screens and newspaper front pages throughout the region. Prominent family accused of decades-long fraud against own daughter. Douglas family secrets exposed in explosive court testimony. Father turns on wife, confirms years of financial crimes. The family that had prided itself on reputation, on social standing, on being pillars of their community, was suddenly the subject of whispered gossip and pointed avoidance. Friends who had admired the Douglas family for years now crossed the street to avoid being seen with them. Neighbors who had attended their garden parties stopped returning calls. Margaret's country club, where she had held court for decades as a prominent member, quietly revoked her membership with a tersely worded letter citing conduct unbecoming. The social empire she had built through manipulation and carefully cultivated appearances collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. Richard moved out of the family home within a week of his testimony, unable to face the wife he had finally betrayed for the sake of truth. He rented a small apartment across town, reportedly refusing to speak to Margaret or her lawyers. When Jessica was approached for comment by reporters, she did something that shocked everyone who knew the family's dynamics. She provided a written statement to the court, detailing everything she had witnessed growing up, the favoritism that had shaped her into someone she did not want to be, the cruelty that had damaged her sister beyond measure, the financial manipulation she had been too afraid to expose. The golden child was finally standing in the light, and she was pointing directly at the darkness that had created her. 2 weeks after the trial's explosive first day, Margaret's lawyers requested a meeting. They claimed she wanted to settle privately to end the public humiliation and reach an agreement that would satisfy everyone involved. Against Mr. Patterson's advice, I agreed to meet her. Part of me needed to see what had become of the woman who had terrorized my childhood, needed to witness the consequences of her actions with my own eyes. The Margaret who sat across from me in that conference room was a shadow of the imperious woman I had feared my entire life. She was pale and trembling, her expensive clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to have shrunk. The carefully maintained facade of youth and vigor had crumbled, revealing every one of her 67 years and more. She looked like what she was, a sick old woman whose schemes had finally caught up with her. She offered me a deal. She would sign over a portion of the disputed assets, enough to make me comfortable for life if I agreed to drop the case and keep everything quiet. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the commanding tone I remembered, replaced by something almost pathetic. "Haven't you taken enough?" she pleaded. "I'm an old woman, Karen. I'm sick. My heart is failing. Whatever I did it because I was trapped. Trapped in a marriage I didn't want, trapped with a child that wasn't my husband's, trapped in a life I never chose. I was trying to survive. Can't you understand that?" For a moment, something stirred in my chest that might have been pity. She was pathetic now, diminished, stripped of the power that had made her terrifying. She was just a frightened woman facing the end of her life with nothing but regret and ruin to show for it. But then I thought about Lily's tears on Christmas night, her innocent face crumbling as her grandmother rejected her handmade gift. I thought about Noah standing up to defend me when no one else would. I thought about Harold carrying my photograph in his wallet for 40 years, loving a daughter he was forbidden to see. I thought about Eleanor, who died keeping secrets she never wanted to keep, who spent her final months preparing weapons for a battle she would not live to see. I looked at Margaret with quiet, devastating calm. "You taught me something valuable, Mother," I said, my voice steady. "You taught me that survival means never backing down from a fight. You taught me that some people will take everything from you if you let them. So no, I won't accept your deal. You're going to face the consequences of what you've done. Not because I want revenge, but because my children deserve to know that justice exists, that the truth matters, that the wicked don't always win." I stood to leave, but my phone buzzed urgently in my purse. Sarah Mitchell's name flashed across the screen. I answered, and her voice was tight with fear. "Karen, come quick. Dad's taken a turn for the worse. The doctors say you need to come now." I rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding with terror that I would be too late. When I reached Harold's room, he was conscious, but barely, his face gray against the white pillows, his breathing shallow and labored. He saw me enter and gestured weakly for me to come closer. I leaned down, taking his frail hand in mine, and he whispered with what seemed like the last of his strength. "The key, Karen. The house. Go there before There's something you need to see. Something about your grandmother's final gift." His fingers tightened around mine with surprising urgency. "It's bigger than you know." The machine surrounding Harold's bed beeped with a steady rhythm that somehow made the silence between us more profound. I held his frail hand in both of mine, feeling the papery thinness of his skin, the fragile bones beneath the fading warmth of a life slowly ebbing away. Sarah and Michael stood near the window, keeping a respectful distance to give me these precious moments with a father I had only just found. Their presence was a comfort, a reminder that whatever happened in this room, I would not face it alone. Harold's eyes opened, and despite the weakness ravaging his body, they were clear and focused with an intensity that seemed to draw on reserves I did not know he still possessed. He looked at me with an expression of such profound love and regret that it made my breath catch in my throat. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of decades of unspoken truth. "When I gave up the fight for you all those years ago, I didn't just fail you, Karen. I failed myself. I became someone I never wanted to be, a man who abandoned his own child because he was too afraid to face the consequences of loving her. He paused to gather strength, and I could see the effort it cost him to speak. But he pushed forward, determined to say what he needed to say before time ran out. "I spent the rest of my life trying to be a good father to Sarah and Michael," he continued. "I told myself that if I could raise them right, if I could give them everything I should have given you, it would somehow make up for what I did. But it never did. You were always there, Karen, in the back of my mind, in my dreams, in every photograph of a little girl I saw on the street. The daughter I abandoned, the child I should have fought for. The guilt never went away. It just became part of who I was." Tears streamed down my face as I listened, my heart breaking for this man who had carried such a heavy burden for so long. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that I forgave him, that the past did not matter anymore. But he was not finished, and I sensed he needed to complete his confession before he could find peace. "After Patricia died," Harold said, his voice growing weaker with each sentence, "I thought about contacting you. I was alone for the first time in decades, and all I could think about was you. I hired a private investigator to find your current address. I wrote letters I never sent. I drove past your apartment building 3 times trying to gather the courage to knock on your door." His eyes filled with fresh tears. "But then Margaret found out somehow. I don't know how, maybe she had been monitoring me all along. She sent me a letter threatening to destroy everything I loved if I ever contacted you. She said she would tell Sarah and Michael things that would make them hate me. She said she would come after you, make your life even worse than it already was." His grip tightened on my hand with surprising strength. I was afraid again, Karen. After all those years, after all the regret, I was still a coward. I stayed silent to protect everyone else, and in doing so, I failed you one more time. "You're not a coward now," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "You helped me find the truth. You stood by me when it mattered. That counts for something, Harold. That counts for everything." He shook his head slowly, refusing the absolution I was trying to offer. "I need you to promise me something," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with fierce determination. "Don't let Eleanor's sacrifice be in vain. Your grandmother spent her final years preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, hiding assets, making sure you would have everything you need to fight back against the woman who stole your birthright." He struggled to breathe, and I saw Sarah step forward with concern before stopping herself. Harold needed to finish this. We all knew it. "The house she left you," he continued. "It's not just a house. It's her legacy. Everything she couldn't say while she was alive, everything she wanted you to know, it's all there. She told me once that she had prepared something special, something that would ensure justice, even if she wasn't alive to see it delivered." His eyes searched mine with desperate intensity. "Promise me you'll find it. Promise me you'll use it. Promise me you'll win." "I promise," I said, squeezing his hand. "I'll win this, Harold. For Eleanor. For you. For myself." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "Not for revenge," he whispered. "Not for money. Win because you deserve to know, finally, that you were always loved. You were never a mistake, Karen. You were never unwanted. You were always a gift." His voice cracked with emotion. "Your grandmother knew it. I knew it. And someday Margaret will die knowing it too. She will die knowing that she couldn't destroy you, couldn't erase you, couldn't win." His eyes began to close, exhaustion finally overwhelming his determination to speak. But his grip on my hand remained firm, a physical connection I was terrified to lose. I sat there in silence, listening to the beeping of machines, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, praying for more time that I knew was not coming. Suddenly, the heart monitor changed rhythm. The steady beeping became erratic, then frantic. Alarms began blaring throughout the room. Doctors and nurses rushed in, pushing me aside with practiced urgency surrounding Harold's bed, with equipment and expertise, and desperate attempts to save a life that was slipping away. Through the chaos of medical personnel and shouted instructions, I saw Harold's eyes open one last time. His lips moved, forming words so faint I had to strain to hear them over the alarms. "The attic," he whispered. "The truth is in the attic." Then his hand went limp in mine, slipping away like a leaf falling from a tree. The frantic beeping of the heart monitor dissolved into a single continuous tone. A flat line. The sound of a father I had found too late, leaving me forever. The 2 weeks between Harold's death and the final hearing passed in a blur of grief and preparation. We buried my father on a gray Thursday morning, the cemetery filled with people I had never met, but who all seemed to carry pieces of Harold with them. Former colleagues spoke of his integrity and generosity. Neighbors described years of quiet kindness, help given without expectation of return. Friends from his church shared stories of a man who had struggled privately with guilt, but who had never let that struggle diminish his compassion for others. I listened to each tribute with tears streaming down my face, mourning a father I had known for only a few months, but who had given me something I had searched for my entire life: proof that I was wanted, evidence that I had always been loved. When it came time for the eulogy, I stood before the crowd of mourners and spoke from a heart that was simultaneously broken and full. I told them about finding Harold, about the photograph he had carried for 40 years, about his regret and his redemption. I told them about a man who had made terrible mistakes, but who had spent his final weeks trying desperately to make things right. And I promised him that I would finish what he and Eleanor had started. Justice would be served. The truth would finally prevail. Now, 2 weeks later, I walked into the courtroom for the final hearing with that promise burning in my chest. The gallery behind me was filled with my family, the real family I had built from the ashes of lies and betrayal. Sarah and Michael Mitchell sat in the front row, their presence a testament to Harold's legacy and their acceptance of me as their sister. Noah sat beside them, my 15-year-old son, who had started this entire journey with 6 words that changed everything. And Jessica, my sister, by blood, if not by upbringing, had taken a seat on my side of the courtroom, having fully and publicly severed ties with the mother who had manipulated us both. Across the aisle, Margaret sat alone. Richard was notably absent, reportedly having moved to a small apartment across town and refusing all contact with his estranged wife. The high-powered attorney she had hired seemed diminished somehow, his confidence clearly shaken by the mountain of evidence that had been presented over the preceding days. Margaret herself looked like a ghost of the woman who had terrorized my childhood, her expensive clothes hanging loose on a frame that had withered under the weight of exposure and stress. Mr. Patterson presented our case with methodical precision. The forged trust documents analyzed by handwriting experts who confirmed Margaret's alterations. The stolen inheritance traced through decades of financial records by Dr. Chen's forensic accounting. The intercepted payments from Harold, documented in bank statements that showed deposits Margaret had no legitimate claim to. The custodial account fraud laid bare in documents that proved she had drained my funds years before I reached adulthood. And finally, Eleanor's video confession played once more for the jury, Margaret's own voice condemning her in words that could not be denied or explained away. The defense tried everything. Henderson argued that Eleanor had been mentally incompetent when she recorded the video, her judgment impaired by illness and medication. He claimed that I had manipulated Harold on his deathbed, convincing a dying man to support accusations that served my financial interests. He even suggested that the video had been doctored, altered by sophisticated technology to put words in Margaret's mouth that she had never spoken. But expert witnesses demolished each argument systematically. Eleanor's medical records showed no cognitive impairment. Harold's deposition given before his final decline was coherent and consistent. Audio forensics confirmed the video was authentic and unaltered. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Patricia Morrison, made her skepticism of the defense's arguments increasingly clear as the hearing progressed. Her questions to Henderson grew sharper, her patience thinner, her expressions more openly dismissive. When both sides rested, she instructed the jury with language that left little doubt about her own conclusions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, I held my breath, acutely aware that my entire future hung on the words about to be spoken. The foreperson, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stood and read the verdict in a clear, steady voice. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, forgery, financial misappropriation. Margaret was ordered to repay all stolen funds over $400,000 plus interest and damages. The irrevocable trust Eleanor had established was restored to its original terms with me as the rightful beneficiary. I expected to feel triumph. I expected elation, vindication, the sweet satisfaction of justice finally served. But as the verdict was read, I felt none of those things. Only a profound sense of closure of a chapter finally ending of wounds that could now begin to heal. I looked at Margaret as the bailiff approached to escort her from the courtroom, and for the first time in my life I saw her clearly. Not as a villain, not as a monster, just a deeply broken woman whose cruelty had destroyed everyone around her, including herself. Her eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I saw nothing there but emptiness. Whatever she had been trying to protect, whatever she had been fighting to preserve, was gone forever. I walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the people who truly loved me. Sarah hugged me fiercely. Michael shook my hand with tears in his eyes. Noah wrapped his arms around me without words, his embrace saying everything that needed to be said. Jessica stood slightly apart, uncertain of her place in this new configuration of family, but I reached out and pulled her into our circle. We had both survived Margaret. We would both heal. My phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Patterson, who had stayed behind to handle final paperwork. "One more thing," the message read. "Probate court just confirmed. Your grandmother's house has officially transferred to your name. The key Harold gave you should open it." I pulled the ornate key from my purse and held it in my palm, feeling its weight, its promise, its mystery. Noah looked at it curiously. "So what's in the house that Grandma Eleanor wanted you to find so badly?" he asked. I thought of Harold's final words whispered in the moments before his heart gave out. The attic. The truth is in the attic. My journey was not quite over yet. "I don't know," I said quietly. "But I think we're about to find out what my grandmother spent her final years protecting." The memorial service for Harold Mitchell was held on a crisp Saturday morning 3 weeks after the trial ended. I stood in the front row of the modest church he had attended for decades, flanked by Sarah and Michael, accepted at last as a full member of the Mitchell family. Their spouses and children surrounded us, a constellation of relatives I was still learning to know, all of them welcoming me with a warmth that continued to surprise and overwhelm me. For 42 years I had believed I had no family worth claiming. Now I was drowning in family, and every moment of it felt like a gift I did not deserve, but would never stop cherishing. Harold had left specific instructions for his memorial. He did not want a somber affair filled with tears and black clothing. He wanted a celebration of life, a gathering where people would share happy memories and laugh at old stories, and remember him as he had been at his best, rather than mourn who he had become at the end. The church was decorated with flowers from his garden, photographs from every decade of his life, and a banner that read, "Well done, good and faithful servant," in letters Harold himself had chosen. Former colleagues rose to speak about his integrity in business, how he had always chosen the honest path, even when it cost him opportunities and advancement. Neighbors described years of quiet generosity, snow shoveled from driveways without being asked, groceries delivered to elderly residents who could not drive, advice freely given to young couples struggling to make their mortgages. Sarah shared memories of learning to ride a bicycle with Harold running alongside her, his hands ready to catch her if she fell, his voice constant with encouragement. Michael talked about fishing trips that were really excuses for father-son conversations, about life advice dispensed over tangled lines and empty coolers. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the podium on legs that trembled with emotion. I looked out at the crowd of people who had loved Harold, many of them for far longer than I had known he existed, and I spoke from a heart that was broken and grateful in equal measure. Harold Mitchell didn't get to be my father for very long. I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. But in those few months, he gave me something I had searched for my entire life. Proof that I was wanted. Evidence that I was loved. He showed me photographs he had carried for 40 years. He introduced me to siblings I never knew I had. He stood beside me as I fought for justice against people who had spent decades trying to erase me from existence. I paused, gathering strength. Harold made mistakes. He would be the first to admit that. But he spent his whole life trying to make amends, trying to be the kind of man who deserved forgiveness. And in the end, he earned it. I forgive you, Dad. I love you. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure your sacrifice was not in vain. After the service, the Mitchell family gathered at Harold's house for the reading of his will. His attorney, Mr. Patterson, presided over the proceedings with professional solemnity. As expected, Harold had divided his estate equally among his 3 children. Sarah Michael and Karen Mitchell, each receiving a third of everything he had built over his lifetime. The formal acknowledgement of my place in his family, enshrined in legal documents that could never be contested or denied, brought fresh tears to eyes I thought had no more crying left to do. But there was a surprise. Harold had left me something additional, a letter to be read privately, separate from the formal will. Mr. Patterson handed me the sealed envelope with a knowing look, and I tucked it into my purse to open when I was alone. That evening, sitting in my small apartment with Noah asleep in the next room, I finally opened Harold's final message to me. His handwriting was shaky, clearly written in his final days when his strength was failing, but his words were as clear and determined as his voice had been in the hospital. He wrote about his pride in finally knowing his firstborn daughter, about the joy those brief months had brought him after decades of regret. He wrote about his certainty that Eleanor was smiling somewhere, watching the truth finally come to light after so many years in darkness. And he wrote specific instructions that made my heart pound with anticipation. "The key I gave you doesn't just open Eleanor's house," he had written. "It opens a safety deposit box in the attic, one that Eleanor set up secretly in your name only decades ago. She made me promise to keep the key safe until you were ready to find what she left behind. I believe you're ready now, Karen. Go find your grandmother's final gift." The next morning, I drove to Eleanor's house for the first time. It was a modest cottage on the outskirts of town, exactly the kind of warm, welcoming home I had always imagined living in as a child. The paint was slightly faded, the garden overgrown from years of neglect, but the bones of the structure were sound and beautiful. This was not a showpiece designed to impress visitors. This was a home built for living, for loving, for creating memories that would last generations. I walked through rooms that smelled faintly of lavender and old books, my fingers trailing over furniture I vaguely remembered from childhood visits. Eleanor's presence was everywhere I looked. Handmade quilts draped over chairs, walls covered with family photographs, and I was stunned to see my own face prominently featured in many of them. A small garden visible through the kitchen window, flowers struggling to survive without their tender's care. This was what a real home felt like. This was what love looked like when it was embedded in walls and floors and window frames. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, key in hand, my heart pounding with anticipation. The space was dusty, but organized boxes labeled with dates and names, old furniture covered with white sheets like sleeping ghosts. And there, in the far corner, exactly where Harold's letter said it would be, I found a small, fireproof safe built into the wall. I inserted the ornate key, turned it, and held my breath as the safe door swung open. Inside was a single envelope, and something that made me gasp aloud. Stacks of documents, bearer bonds, stock certificates, and a handwritten note in my grandmother's familiar, elegant script. "My darling Karen," the note read, "they stole your past. This will secure your future. There's more money here than they ever knew I had. It was always meant for you." I sat on the dusty attic floor for what felt like hours, surrounded by the evidence of my grandmother's secret love. The bearer bonds alone were worth more than I had ever dreamed of possessing financial instruments that had appreciated over decades of patient waiting. The stock certificates represented shares in companies Eleanor had carefully selected blue-chip investments that had grown steadily while the world forgot they existed. And the cash bundled neatly in denominations that suggested years of careful saving added another layer to a fortune I had never known was mine. When I finally tallied everything using trembling fingers and a calculator I found in one of the attic boxes, the total made me gasp. Nearly $750,000. A lifetime of security that my grandmother had hidden away for the day when I would need it most. Eleanor's handwritten note explained everything, her elegant script filling page after page with truths she had been unable to speak while alive. She had known from the beginning that I was not Richard's child. She had suspected it from the moment she first held me as an infant, noticing that my hazel eyes looked nothing like anyone in the Douglas family, that my features carried echoes of a stranger rather than the bloodline she knew so well. She had watched Margaret carefully after that, observing the cold distance between mother and daughter, the favoritism toward Jessica that grew more pronounced with each passing year. And she had realized, long before anyone confirmed it, that her daughter-in-law was capable of terrible cruelty. So Eleanor had prepared. Quietly, secretly, over decades of careful planning, she had accumulated wealth that Margaret never knew existed. Money squirreled away from birthday gifts and holiday bonuses. Investments made under maiden names and through distant banks. Bearer bonds purchased with cash and stored in safe deposit boxes that were never linked to the Douglas family accounts. All of it hidden, all of it waiting, all of it meant for the granddaughter she loved but could not protect openly. The note continued with Eleanor's final wishes, and her words brought fresh tears to eyes I thought had no more crying left to do. She asked me to use the money not for revenge but for a fresh start, to move somewhere beautiful, to give Noah and Lily a stable home, to build the life I deserved, the life that had been stolen from me by circumstances beyond my control. "I know you, Karen," she wrote. "I know you won't rest until justice is served. So yes, fight for what's rightfully yours. Challenge the lies. Expose the truth. But remember that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's living well while they watch. It's being happy while they stew in the consequences of their cruelty. Build a beautiful life, my darling. That will hurt Margaret more than any courtroom victory ever could." I read those words over and over, feeling my grandmother's love reaching across the years to embrace me. This woman who had been silenced by threats and manipulation, who had watched helplessly as I suffered under Margaret's cruelty, had found another way to protect her beloved granddaughter. She had planned and saved and hidden and hoped, trusting that someday the truth would emerge and I would find my way to this attic, to this safe, to this fortune that was always meant to be mine. With the legal battle won and Eleanor's gift secured, I began building the new life she had envisioned for me. I moved into her cottage with Noah and Lily, leaving behind the cramped apartment that had been our home for too many years of struggle. The renovation process was slow and deliberate, each change made with respect for the character Eleanor had built into these walls. New paint that complemented the original trim, updated appliances that fit the cottage's modest aesthetic, repairs to the garden that brought Eleanor's flowers back to blooming life. For the first time in 42 years, I had a home that truly belonged to me. Not a childhood house where I was barely tolerated. Not a marital home that dissolved when my husband found someone younger. Not a rental apartment where I was at the mercy of landlords and leases. This cottage, with its lavender-scented rooms and photographs of me on every wall, was mine. Given with love by someone who had always believed in me, even when I could not believe in myself. I watched Noah help Lily plant flowers in the garden, their laughter carrying through the open windows on spring breezes that smelled of possibility. I saw my children thriving in their new environment. Noah making friends at a better school. Lily running through rooms where love had soaked into the very foundations. And I felt something I had not experienced since early childhood, before I understood that my mother hated me, before I learned to armor my heart against constant rejection. I felt peace. Genuine, profound, healing peace. The months passed gently in our cottage. Summer arrived with long evenings on the porch and fireflies dancing in the garden Eleanor had planted decades ago. The legal settlement from Margaret's fraud conviction began arriving in structured payments, adding to the security Eleanor's hidden fortune had already provided. Sarah and Michael visited regularly, their children playing with Lily, while the adults shared meals and memories and the slow process of becoming a real family. Even Jessica came, once awkward but sincere in her desire to rebuild a sisterly relationship that had never been allowed to form. I was in the kitchen one September evening making dinner while Lily drew pictures at the table and Noah helped with homework he claimed was too easy when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window expecting Sarah or perhaps a delivery, and my blood turned to ice. An old sedan sat in front of my house, modest and unfamiliar. And stepping out of it, moving slowly, like people for whom every step required conscious effort, were my parents. Richard emerged first, looking older than I had ever seen him, his shoulders hunched with defeat. Then he walked around to the passenger side and helped Margaret out of the car. She was leaning heavily on his arm, her once imperious posture crumbled into something fragile and desperate. They walked toward my door, and I stood frozen at the window watching the people who had tried to erase me from existence approach the home where I had finally found happiness. This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The final confrontation. I opened the door before they could knock, standing in the threshold of my grandmother's house, like a guardian at the gates of a sanctuary they had no right to enter. The people before me bore little resemblance to the imposing figures who had dominated my childhood nightmares. Margaret was gaunt beneath her expensive coat, leaning heavily on a cane I had never seen her use before. Her once sharp eyes dulled by defeat and the illness that was slowly claiming her life. Richard stood beside her, no longer the distant cold man who had refused to meet my gaze for 40 years. He looked broken, weighted down by decades of guilt that had finally been dragged into the light. "May we come in?" Margaret asked, and her voice was stripped of every trace of the arrogance I remembered. It was the voice of an old woman who had lost everything and knew it. I hesitated for a long moment, every instinct screaming at me to close the door in their faces and return to the peaceful life I had built. But something made me step aside. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the need for one final confrontation. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that this chapter could not truly close until I faced them one last time. They sat in Eleanor's living room, surrounded by the evidence of a love they had tried to steal from me but never could destroy. My grandmother's photographs watched from every wall, her quilts draped over furniture, her presence embedded in every corner of the home she had secretly left to me. Margaret's eyes darted around the room, taking in the testament to a relationship she had tried so hard to sever. She began speaking, and for once I let her talk without interruption. She told me about her own unhappy childhood, about parents who had valued appearance over affection, about learning early that love was transactional, and survival meant manipulation. She told me about her desperate marriage to Richard, about feeling trapped in a life she had never wanted, about the affair with Harold, that had seemed like escape until it became another cage. She told me about the terror she felt when she realized the pregnancy could not be hidden, when the DNA test confirmed her worst fears, when every scheme she had constructed began crumbling around her. It was not an apology. It was not even really an explanation. It was Margaret trying to make me understand that she too had been a victim, that her cruelty had been born from her own suffering. And perhaps there was truth in her words. Perhaps she had been damaged long before she damaged me. But understanding the source of someone's cruelty does not obligate you to accept it. When she finally asked for forgiveness, I recognized the request for what it truly was. Not genuine remorse for the pain she had caused. Fear. Fear of dying with the weight of her sins, unabsolved, of facing whatever came next with my condemnation hanging over her. She wanted forgiveness not because she had earned it, but because she needed it for herself. Richard spoke next, and his words carried a different weight entirely. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion I had never heard from him before. "I failed you in every way a father can fail. I knew you were innocent, Knew you had done nothing to deserve how we treated you, and I let you be punished anyway, because I was angry at someone else's choices." He looked at me with eyes swimming in tears. "I watched you in that courtroom, Karen. I saw the woman you've become despite everything we did to hold you down. You became everything we tried to prevent. Strong, honest, brave." He paused, struggling to continue. "I'm proud of you. I should have said it decades ago. I should have said it every day of your life." Tears were rolling down the face of a man I had never thought capable of crying, and something shifted in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close to it. An easing of the knot of resentment I had carried for so long. I looked at both of my parents and spoke calmly, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I spent my whole life wanting you to love me, wanting you to be proud of me, wanting to understand why I was never good enough." I paused, letting the words settle in the room. "But I don't need that anymore. I've found people who love me without conditions. Harold, Eleanor, my children, Sarah and Michael, who barely know me but have already given me more acceptance than you ever did." I stood, signaling that our conversation was ending. "I forgive you, both of you. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger is exhausting, and I refuse to let you take anything more from me than you already have. But forgiveness doesn't mean access. I'm not going to invite you into my life or my children's lives. You can find your peace however you need to find it, but you won't find it here." I walked them to the door, this final act of escort feeling like the closing of a book I had been reading my entire life. Margaret said nothing as she passed through the threshold, her shoulders hunched with a defeat that seemed permanent. But Richard paused, turning to look at me one last time. "I understand," he said quietly. "Goodbye, Karen." I closed the door gently behind them, listening to their slow footsteps retreat down the path. The car doors open and close, the engines start and fade into distance. And then there was silence. Beautiful, healing silence. That evening, after Noah and Lily were asleep, I sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The journey from that terrible Christmas night to this moment of peace seemed impossibly long, yet somehow I had survived it. I had more than survived. I had won. Noah appeared beside me holding a dusty envelope. "I found this tucked into Grandma Eleanor's favorite book," he said. "The one you said she used to read to you." I opened the envelope with trembling hands and unfolded the letter inside, recognizing immediately my grandmother's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Karen," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you found your way home at last. You were never a mistake. You were never a burden. From the moment you were born, you were a miracle. I loved you from your first breath to my last. You were not abandoned, Karen. You were stolen from the people who loved you. But now you've taken yourself back, and that makes you the bravest person I've ever known. Live well, my darling. You were always loved. You were always enough. You were always mine, forever and always. Your grandmother, Eleanor." I held the letter to my heart as tears streamed down my face. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of finally understanding that I had been loved all along. "Thank you, Grandma," I whispered to the stars. "I found my way home." From inside the house, Lily's sleepy voice called out, "Mommy!" I wiped my eyes, smiled, and walked back inside to my children, my home and the life I was always meant to have. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Karen's journey reminds us that the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it's buried. And sometimes the family we choose loves us more than the family we're born into. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything? Do you think Karen made the right choice by forgiving her parents, but closing the door on them forever? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Every subscribe helps this channel grow and brings more stories of courage, justice, and redemption to people who need to hear them. Thank you for watching. And remember, you were always enough. You were always worthy of love.